Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time of lords and peasants, castles and candlelight, where the rules were strange, the smells were questionable, and justice often meant whatever the guy with the sword says. You step out into the cobbled street of a medieval town, tugging your tunic tighter against the morning chill, but wait, what you're wearing might just get you arrested. Imagine velvet sleeves brushing against weathered wood carts, the soft shuffle of woolen boots over gravel, and banners snapping in the breeze. The sun climbs slowly over the thatched rooftops, bathing everything in warm gold. But behind the scenes, social tension hums like a taut lute string. You don't notice the man watching you from the corner. He's not a thief or a rival. No, he's something worse, a sumptuary law enforcer. You see, in medieval Europe, what you wore wasn't just about fashion. It was about your place in the human pyramid. From the color of your cloak to the length of your hat feather, everything screamed your social rank. And if you wore something you weren't entitled to, that was illegal. You could be fined, publicly shamed, or even thrown in jail for wearing clothes above your station. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post your location and the current time in the comments. I'd love to see where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the bustling market, adjusting the fur-lined edge of your hood. A mistake. You're not supposed to have fur. You're a baker's apprentice, technically a lower tradesman, and fur is for merchants at least. Velvet? Only knights and up. Silk? Don't even look at it. That stuff is reserved for the upper crust, the landowners, nobles, and royalty. And yet, here you are, trying to look a little sharper for your sweetheart at the apothecary's stall. These laws, called sumptuary laws, were widespread across Europe during the Middle Ages. England, Italy, France, the Holy Roman Empire, you name it, they had them. And they weren't just arbitrary rules. Well, they were mostly arbitrary, but the idea was to preserve the delicate hierarchy of medieval society. If a peasant started dressing like a noble, how would anyone know their place? Historians still argue whether these laws were really about moral decay or just the upper class being extremely insecure. But one thing's certain, the laws were weirdly specific. In England, a law from the 14th century banned women of loose morals from wearing fur-trimmed gowns. In Florence, only nobles could wear certain shades of crimson. In Spain, sumptuary laws even limited the size and decoration of sleeve openings. Yes, even your armpits were subject to legal review. It gets better. Knights below a certain income couldn't wear belts with silver buckles. If you earned under £100 per year in England, forget gold jewelry entirely. Oh, and that hat with the feather you picked up at the fair? If it's more than 2 fingers wide, it's too luxurious for you. Confiscated. Featherless now. Sad. The irony? Nobles were the biggest offenders. They'd pass these laws, then immediately flout them. Imagine lawmakers today banning private jets and then posting from their Gulf Stream on Instagram. Medieval hypocrisy at its finest. But here's where it gets deliciously odd. Sometimes these laws were weaponized. Say you're a merchant with a grudge. You see your competitor wearing a slightly shiny doublet. Maybe it's satin, maybe it's just clean. You report him. He gets fined. You get rid of the competition. A petty, pre-LinkedIn power move. In some towns, clothing inspectors literally roamed the streets, watching for fashion infractions like moral mall cops. These wardens could stop you, question your social status, and drag you before a magistrate if your boots were too finely stitched. The entire system relied on public policing, neighbors snitching on neighbors for looking a bit too fabulous. And here's a kicker for the romantic listeners. Love itself got snared in these regulations. You might fall for someone above your class and want to dress up to woo them. But even that little rebellion was dangerous. A wool-clad stable boy wearing silk gloves to impress a noblewoman could end up beaten, fined, or worse, ostracized from the community for pretending to be what he was not. Let's not forget the church. Ah, yes, the ever-watchful clergy who equated flashy clothes with sin. Excessive ornamentation, they argued, was vanity, and vanity led straight to the devil's doorstep. Monks gave sermons on modesty while nobles strutted in brocade. It was less about godliness and more about gatekeeping. There's one hilarious fringe case from France where a merchant's wife was tried for wearing a pearl-studded girdle, something reserved for the aristocracy. Her defense? She claimed the pearls were fake. The court brought in an expert, a medieval gem appraiser. Plot twist. They were real. She was fined, and her girdle was seized and gifted to the magistrate's wife. Justice, right? Sumptuary laws didn't just target individuals, though. They reinforced economic divides. Tailors, shoemakers, and cloth merchants were often banned from even selling certain materials to lower classes. That way, even if you had the coin, you couldn't get the goods, unless, of course, you went to the black market, which, yes, did exist for fancy medieval clothes. Secret satin deals in candlelit basements. Picture a hooded figure whispering, "Psst, want a forbidden codpiece?" And like any system that rigid, enforcement was inconsistent. In cities like Florence or London, you might get caught for a fashion felony. But out in the countryside, you could probably strut in purple if no one told the bailiff. Local culture mattered too. What was forbidden in England might be perfectly legal in Venice. That's how fashion smugglers thrived, sneaking forbidden fabrics across borders like 14th century Gucci mules. Eventually, the laws faded. The rise of the merchant class, the slow erosion of feudalism, and the economic shifts after the Black Death made enforcement trickier. As people moved into cities and wealth became less land-based and more money-based, the idea that a rich tailor couldn't wear velvet while a broke baron could just stop making sense. Still, some of the laws stuck around unnaturally long. In England, some sumptuary statutes remained technically on the books until the 17th century. So now, as you walk past a mirror or a polished chunk of bronze, you check your outfit. Nothing too fancy, no shimmering silk, just wool, plain brown wool, safe, simple, and boring. But in a world where your pants could get you imprisoned, boring might just be the best choice. At least no one's questioned your shoes yet. Those are definitely legal, right? You glance down at your hands covered in flour. The sun is still rising, and already your apron is dusted white. You're helping your master baker prepare the day's loaves, kneading dough that's dense and heavy with grain. But you're not just thinking about how much it weighs. You're worried about how much it weighs. Because in medieval Europe, if your bread is even slightly too heavy, too light, too expensive, or even too good, you might end up in stocks or with your ear nailed to the door of your own shop. Yes, really, Your bread can betray you. You brush crumbs from the counter and watch your master place the dough on an iron scale. He squints. It's just under the approved weight. That's a problem. In fact, it's potentially a criminal problem. Medieval authorities loved regulating food, especially bread. And while that might sound oddly wholesome, like a quaint little bake-off rule, it was anything but. Bread was life in medieval towns. For the poor, it made up as much as 70% of daily calories. So if a baker was shorting people, even accidentally, there could be riots, or lawsuits, or mobs with pitchforks. No pressure, though. That's where the Assize of Bread and Ale comes in. Issued in England in 1266, it was one of the most long-lasting legal documents of the Middle Ages. This law regulated the size, price, and ingredients of bread and beer. But it wasn't just a guide. It was binding. Break the rules, and you'd face a very public punishment. Historians still argue whether the assize was designed more for consumer protection or as a method of social control, but either way, it meant your livelihood depended on mastering your scales and your math. The formula: a fixed price for a fixed weight. But here's the twist. Grain prices fluctuated wildly due to harvests, war, weather, and general medieval chaos. So the approved price of bread would actually change depending on how much flour cost that week. Local officials were supposed to recalculate the prices regularly. But of course, they didn't always do it well or fairly. So bakers learned to either bake extra heavy loaves, just to be safe, or to include a baker's dozen, an extra loaf or roll added to an order of 12, just in case one got disqualified by the bread police. That's right, the phrase baker's dozen wasn't generosity. It was insurance. You scrape a bit of dough from your sleeve as you remember the story of poor Margaret of Norwich, a baker fined in the 14th century for selling underweight pottage loaves. The difference? Less than an ounce. But the fine was brutal. Worse yet, repeat offenders could have their ovens destroyed. That's not a euphemism. Officials literally smashed the hearth. No oven, no business. And if you tried to sell again without permission, you could be branded. Picture it. Your neighbor walks by, bread in hand, and casually says, "Oh yeah, that guy. He used to sell fake rye. Check the scar on his hand." Not exactly great marketing. Oh, and for the alewives, women who brewed beer at home, it could be even worse. Brewing was one of the few trades open to women in many towns, and ale was so common it was almost considered a food. But if your beer was too weak, or heaven forbid you overcharged, you'd find yourself dunked in the cucking stool. That's a nice way of saying they tied you to a chair and dropped you repeatedly into a cold river while the townsfolk laughed. All for watery ale. Back to bread, though. If you lived in France, things weren't much different. In Paris, the boulangerie laws were so strict that you could only sell bread in approved shapes and styles. Circle bread, square bread, triangular bread, all dictated by the guild. Deviate, and you risk being fined or banned from the market entirely. Even stranger, there were inspectors called bread weighers. Their entire job was to check bread at stalls, sometimes with portable scales, and report any violations. If they caught you cheating, they could confiscate your loaves on the spot and hand them out to the poor as punishment and public humiliation. "Here's your fine," they'd say, "and here's your bread being enjoyed by the folks you shortchanged." Talk about adding insult to injury. And you weren't just punished for underweight loaves. Overweight loaves were also frowned upon, especially if they sold for the same price as smaller ones. It distorted the market, annoyed your fellow bakers, and could get you called a cheat. Too small? Criminal. Too big? Suspicious. Just right? Only if you double-check that scale. By now, your own loaf is ready for the oven, and your arms ache from all the kneading. You pass it off to the apprentice at the fire, knowing he'll stare at it like it's gold. Because it kind of is. One wrong rise, one light crust, one sneaky air pocket, and the bailiff might come knocking. And here's a quirky bit. Some towns issued official bread templates, like molds made of wood or clay. You'd plop your dough into the mold, bake it, and it had to come out matching the approved dimensions. It's like cookie cutters, but if you mess up, you don't just get ugly cookies, you get fined. Even the smell of bread became a point of contention. In London, laws were passed requiring bakers to bake at certain hours to avoid flooding the streets with the scent of warm bread before the market opened. People would line up too early, creating crowds, noise, and complaints. You could call it the world's first anti-sourdough trend. Of course, all of this assumed your ingredients were honest. Medieval bread often contained some interesting additives: chalk, mashed beans, old breadcrumbs, and even sawdust found their way into flour during shortages. And yes, that was illegal, but hard to prove until someone got sick or passed out mid-morning mass. Then suddenly, the bread inspector is banging on your cellar door again. Some records even mention secret ovens, small illegal bake sites used to produce black market bread that didn't follow regulations. Underground baking rings. Literally. You imagine sneaking down stone steps at midnight, a stolen bag of rye on your shoulder, and a lookout stationed by the door, all to make a loaf that doesn't follow the grain tax. Today, we grumble about rising bread prices at the supermarket, but back then, bread was a legal battlefield. Your crust could cost you your career. A loaf was your livelihood, and one angry noblewoman or greedy inspector could bring it all crashing down, like a poorly proofed sourdough. Still, as you bite into your morning loaf, warm, crusty, slightly underbaked, you know you've dodged the punishment for one more day. Your scales were accurate, your loaves acceptable. The bread weighs true. Now, if only you could keep the pigeons off the cooling rack. You dip a cloth into cool well water and dab the sweat from your neck. It's Sunday, day of rest, day of prayer, day of not doing much of anything. Except you smell. Honestly, you do. You've been mucking out stalls all week, walking the muddy lanes, sleeping under a thatch roof shared with a family of squirrels, and your tunic could probably walk off by itself at this point. So naturally you think, maybe a quick bath. Bad idea. A splash of water in the wrong place at the wrong time could mark you not as clean, but as sinful. Welcome to medieval Europe, where bathing on a Sunday could get you fined, shamed, or accused of putting vanity before the Almighty. Yes, really, you could be punished simply for washing your armpits on the Lord's Day. The Church in the Middle Ages wielded enormous power, not just over souls, but over everyday routines. And cleanliness, oddly enough, often got bundled into the same category as temptation. Historians still argue whether this attitude was truly widespread or exaggerated by later myth. But there were documented cases of religious laws and social customs discouraging Sunday hygiene. You were supposed to focus on worship, not your pores. The concern wasn't just time management, it was morality. Cleanliness, especially when it involved the whole body, was considered sensual. Bathhouses, even worse. Public bathing became associated with sin, sexuality, and idleness, especially in the later Middle Ages when plagues and moral panics spread like, well, the plague. So you stand there, dirty and itchy, staring at the barrel bath behind your cottage and wondering if anyone would really report you. It's not like the bishop himself is lurking in the hedges with a towel, but maybe he is. You see, in some towns, local ordinances extended from broader church doctrine. In 14th century England, Sunday bathing was banned in certain parishes, especially during festival days, Lent, or other holy periods. In parts of France and Germany, it was even worse. Public bathhouses were ordered to shut on Sundays, and some clerics warned that anyone who bathed instead of attending Mass might be seen as choosing body over soul. That was heresy light. But don't get the wrong idea. Medieval people weren't filthy by nature. That's a common myth. Many folks liked to bathe. Wealthy nobles had personal bathtubs and attendants to heat the water. Even commoners, when they could, soaked in barrels, rivers, or heated pools. Soap existed, made from animal fat and lye, and lavender oil wasn't just for fancy TikToks. It was sprinkled in rinse water centuries ago. What changed was perception. Early medieval monastic rules actually encouraged bathing. Some monks were allotted 1 bath per month, more if they were ill. But by the high Middle Ages, fears of disease, sin, and overindulgence made bathing increasingly suspicious. The logic? If you're too clean, you're probably hiding something. And don't even think about scented oils. Wearing perfume or sweet waters on Sunday, definitely not holy, unless you're a bishop. Then maybe it's okay. Double standard much? Now, let's talk bathhouses. Those big communal steam and soak centers you might have seen in paintings or awkward Renaissance fair recreations. Bathhouses were common throughout Europe, particularly in cities. And they weren't just for scrubbing. People ate there, napped there, gossiped there, and in some unfortunate cases, met courtesans there. So naturally, the church grew suspicious. Some clergy began calling bathhouses gateways to sin, especially when men and women shared tubs, which they often did. Laws sprang up banning co-ed bathing on holy days, then on all days. Eventually, many towns outlawed bathhouses completely, citing moral decay. Not to mention the whole maybe baths spread the Black Death theory. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Still, Sunday laws persisted even in private. A well-off merchant in Florence might bathe in his marble tub all week, but not on Sunday. A barmaid in York might sneak a bucket rinse before work. But if caught on a Sunday morning, a fine, or worse, public penance. In some places, you were expected to look humble on Sundays. That meant wearing dull clothes, avoiding loud laughter, and, yes, staying visibly dusty. A clean tunic and brushed hair could be taken as prideful, even seductive. You didn't want the neighbors whispering that you were too fresh. One fringe example, in parts of medieval Bohemia, local records mention fines for unseemly grooming on church feast days, specifically naming combing hair, trimming beards, and using scented waters, which means you could get in trouble just for brushing your curls. Sorry, Rapunzel. There's even the classic joke in monastery records. Brother Thomas washed twice this month, once on All Saints' Day and again to escape his sins. Monks laughed at overbathing, and that's from people who spent most of their time copying psalms. And yet, beneath the piety and paranoia, you find the humanity. One scribe's diary from 1390s England records a Sunday where he snuck a bath, despite the bells. He was stressed, tired, itchy. He chose water over worship just once. "May God forgive me," he wrote, "but my back was crawling." Relatable. Today, of course, Sunday is when many of us do all the self-care. Long showers, deep conditioning, charcoal masks, the works. Back then, that might have gotten you a lecture from your priest or a hard slap from your grandmother. So, as you stand in your dusty clothes, weighing the risk, you hear the church bell ring. It's time for Mass. The village is already gathering. The priest will notice if you're absent, and definitely if your cheeks are suspiciously pink from a sneaky bath. You sigh, step away from the tub, and head toward the chapel, sticky and slightly miserable. You'll try again tomorrow. Unless, of course, Monday's law turns out to be even stranger. You kneel before a smoldering fire, heart thudding in your chest. The iron rod lies across the coals, glowing hotter than your skin has ever known. In a few moments, you'll have to pick it up and walk 3 paces, carrying this blazing truth-teller in your bare hand. You don't get a lawyer, you don't get a jury, you get heat. This is trial by ordeal, and specifically, the ordeal of hot iron. Yes, in medieval Europe, you might prove your innocence not with evidence or witnesses, but by gripping something that could cook an egg and hoping God thinks you're telling the truth. You breathe in shallowly. The air smells of smoke, old sweat, and singed flesh. The priest stands beside you, reading solemn verses, the holy words meant to sanctify what's about to happen. Everyone around you watches, not because they doubt the outcome, but because they believe they're about to witness God's justice served sizzling. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but this was terrifyingly real. Across medieval Europe, from the Anglo-Saxons in England to the Franks on the continent, trials by ordeal were a common part of the justice system. And the hot iron test was one of the more popular and brutal versions. Here's how it worked. If you were accused of a crime and there wasn't enough proof either way, you might be given an ordeal. In the case of hot iron, you'd carry a piece of iron, often weighing 1 or 3 pounds, for a specific distance, usually 3 paces. Then your hand would be wrapped in linen and left sealed for 3 days. On the 3rd day, the priest or official would unwrap it and inspect the wound. If your skin had healed cleanly, innocent. If it was festering or infected, guilty. Pretty scientific, right? Historians still argue whether the healing process was genuinely believed to be divine intervention or just wishful thinking wrapped in bandages. Some speculate that sympathetic priests might have helped innocent people pass the test by applying soothing herbs and changing the timing. Others think the odds of success were just high enough to keep belief in the system alive. Either way, you didn't want to end up on the wrong end of a glowing poker. This wasn't the only ordeal, though. There was cold water, too, where you were tied up and tossed into a river. If you floated, you were guilty, because water, pure and holy, was rejecting your sinful body. If you sank, you were innocent, and hopefully someone yanked you out before you drowned. You'd be amazed how many people passed and still ended up waterlogged. But hot iron held a special place in the world of ordeal. Fire symbolized purity. The idea was that divine flame would burn away lies and reveal the truth. Of course, it also burned away your skin, but that was just a bonus, apparently. You're probably thinking, no one actually believed this worked, right? But they did, at least many of them. And belief is powerful. If a community believed that God would protect the innocent, then social order could be maintained through fear of divine consequences. Or at least, it gave people a way to move forward when nobody knew what really happened. And remember, back then, there was no CSI, Canterbury, no fingerprinting, no forensics, no CCTV. Justice was messy, emotional, and often more about community harmony than truth. If a respected figure passed the ordeal, the town could breathe easy. If a known troublemaker failed, no one lost sleep. There's even a quirky tidbit about trial by iron involving the 12th century Bishop of Rochester. He once ordered a noblewoman to undergo the ordeal to prove she hadn't poisoned her husband. When she passed, miraculously unburned, the bishop changed his mind and declared the ordeal unreliable, because apparently God didn't deliver the result he expected. You flex your hand. It's almost time. You've heard stories, how some people rubbed onion skin on their palms to fake injuries later. Others claim priests whispered secret prayers to dull the heat. There were even rumors of forged iron, glowing on the outside, hollow and cooler inside, but most weren't so lucky. And here's where things get even stranger. This was considered a fair method. It was standardized. Rules were written down. There were even specialist ordeal managers, people trained to prepare the iron, measure the steps, and bandage the wounds. You might be undergoing a supernatural test, but it still came with paperwork. Eventually, though, things began to change. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, a massive church meeting led by Pope Innocent III, banned clergy from participating in ordeals. That was a big deal, because these rituals needed priests to bless the objects and oversee the process. Without church support, the credibility of ordeal justice started to crumble, but it didn't vanish overnight. Local lords and communities were slow to give it up. Some parts of Germany and Scandinavia clung to ordeal-style justice into the 13th and even 14th centuries. And in remote areas, old habits died hard. People trusted fire more than they trusted officials. You look at the glowing iron one more time, the crowd hushes, the priest finishes his prayer and nods. You step forward, trembling, and reach out your hand. The heat rushes up your arm before you even touch it. Then, contact. You clench the iron. It hisses. Your skin screams. And you walk, slowly, each pace echoing with pain and anticipation. 3 steps. You drop it. It's done. Your hand is wrapped in linen, and the waiting begins. 3 days. 3 days of burning, throbbing, second-guessing, 3 days of whispered prayers and muttered doubts. And when the cloth is finally unwrapped, your future will depend not on truth or lies, but on how your wound looks to a man in a robe. Sleep tight. You wander along a quiet, reedy riverbank at dusk, watching the water ripple as a familiar silhouette glides by, elegant, white, neck curved like a question mark. The swan. It looks at you like it knows something, like it knows you're not supposed to be looking at it. You pretend you're just admiring the scenery, but deep down, you're thinking one rebellious, deeply illegal thought: what if I ate that swan? Don't, seriously, don't even think it. Because in medieval Europe, swans weren't just birds, they were royal property, and touching one without permission could land you in serious trouble, like lose your hand trouble, or, depending on where you lived, be fined more than you earn in a year trouble. These birds, basically feathered crown jewels. You sit in the tall grass and watch as the swan preens its feathers, completely unaware that it's protected by centuries of status, wealth, and absurd law. You, on the other hand, are not. That bird outranks you. Throughout medieval England especially, swans were legally classified as regal fowl, meaning they belonged exclusively to the monarchy, or to select noble families who had been granted swan rights by the crown. And it wasn't just about birds. This was about control, pageantry, status. A mute swan floating on your estate's pond was as much a flex as a Rolls-Royce in your driveway today. The laws went deep. As early as the 12th century, the crown declared that all unmarked swans in open water were the king's property. If you wanted your own, you had to get a special grant. And then, here's the wild part, you had to mark them, not with paint or ribbons, with notches in their beaks. Yes, swan branding. Historians still argue whether these notches were painful or merely cosmetic. But either way, there was a whole official system of swan ownership management. It was called the Swan Roll, a kind of medieval bird registry. Think of it like the DMV, but for elegant aquatic poultry. Each noble family had its own unique pattern of notches, carefully recorded. If someone found a swan with an unmarked beak, straight to the royal pens. If someone changed a swan's mark to claim it, oof, that was swan theft, a literal felony. And if you dared to eat one without permission, depending on the year and the king's mood, you might face a massive fine, a public shaming, or worse. Swan meat was a delicacy reserved for coronations, royal banquets, and the most elite of elite feasts. You were supposed to stick with chicken. But here's where it gets even more surreal. There was an official swan master, an actual job title. His responsibility was to oversee all the swans on behalf of the crown, especially during swan upping, a ceremonial summer tradition on the River Thames where royal swans were counted, marked, and paraded like feathery VIPs. Imagine it, a whole fleet of boats, men in uniforms, flags flapping, and oars splashing, all for a bird. There's one. That's a Windsor notch. Next. It still happens today in a much gentler, tourist-friendly version. But back then, it was a serious affair. You watch your swan flap its wings and coast downstream, probably off to mingle with a higher-class gaggle. You stay put, because following it would be suspicious. You're not the only one watching. In towns like Oxford and Cambridge, university regulations banned students from interfering with swans because they kept trying to roast them in secret. Can't blame them, really. Goose gets boring after a while. One fringe tale from 13th century Lincolnshire tells of a blacksmith who was caught trying to borrow a swan egg. He claimed it was for study. Nobody bought it. He was fined 2 shillings and lost his tools for 6 weeks. Moral of the story? Don't mess with noble eggs. And if you're thinking, surely they didn't enforce this everywhere, think again. Swan rights were jealously guarded, especially near royal rivers like the Thames, Severn, or Avon. In places like Norfolk, where swans were common, the crown hired swan herders to patrol and protect the flocks. Imagine being paid to babysit birds, except with swords and legal documents. Even owning a dead swan came with paperwork. You had to report it, explain how it died, and sometimes pay a fee just to dispose of it. Because if it wasn't yours, you might be accused of hunting the king's game. Some of the more fringe interpretations of the law even made it illegal to let your dog chase a swan. So now you're in trouble for something your dog did. Classic. The symbolism didn't stop at dinner tables either. Swans were woven into medieval heraldry, literature, and song. In Arthurian legend, swans often appeared as magical omens or enchanted messengers. And in real life, noble families placed swan motifs on their crests to signal wealth and royal favor. There's one record from the late 15th century of a wedding where the feast included 4 swans, roasted and served with their feathers reattached for decoration. Each one was surrounded by musicians, because apparently swan dinner required a soundtrack. But the swans themselves, they didn't know any of this. They just swam, nested, preened, and occasionally hissed at passing peasants, which, to be fair, is very on brand. Eventually, like many medieval laws, the most extreme swan protections faded. But not entirely. Even today in England, all unmarked mute swans on open water are technically the property of the Crown. Yes, even in 2025, Queen Elizabeth II passed that duty on, and now King Charles, though probably not personally, still technically owns most of the wild swans on the Thames. So, as you rise from the grass and head back toward your village, the swan watches you. Its eyes narrow slightly. You nod in respect. Good bird. You have no quarrel. Tonight, you'll settle for turnip stew and dry bread. No feathers required. You kick a pebble down the muddy road, squinting at your own feet in frustration. Your shoes, brand new, handmade by the local cobbler, are getting looks. Not admiring looks, suspicious looks, because the tips of your shoes are just a little too long. Stylish? Definitely. Legal? Not even close. In medieval Europe, your feet could get you fined. You adjust your stride so your curled toes don't trip you. The ends of your shoes curve up a good 6 inches, almost like tiny ski jumps. These aren't just fashion, they're rebellion. And if the local reeve catches you wearing these, you'll be lucky to escape with just a scolding, because these are Krakows, also known as poulaines, and they were once banned for being too fabulous. Yes, in some places, shoes with pointy toes were literally illegal. The fashion began, unsurprisingly, in the 14th century with the nobility. Long-toed shoes started as a statement piece among the elite, particularly in Krakow, hence Krakows, and quickly spread across Europe. The longer the point, the richer the wearer, at least that was the idea. Nobles would strut through court with their toes trailing behind them like fashion flags. The most extreme examples were over 2 feet long and had to be tied to the wearer's knees with little chains or laces to stop them from flopping around. Because, yes, if your footwear requires rigging, it's time to rethink your choices. But naturally, trends trickle down. Soon, the merchant class wanted in. Even some peasants scraped together enough coin to get a pair of pointed shoes, eager to look a little fancier than their neighbors. That's when the authorities stepped in. Sumptuary laws, yes, those again, declared that certain lengths of shoe tip were reserved for specific social classes. For example, nobles could wear toes up to 24 inches long, yes, 2 feet, knights maybe 18 inches, and commoners, you got a modest 6. Anything longer was illegal and laughable. Historians still argue whether the bans were about maintaining class boundaries or just old-fashioned moral outrage. Some clerics and chroniclers called these shoes devil's claws or Satan's stilts, declaring them indecent, impractical, and immoral. After all, if you can't kneel properly in church without tripping over your own feet, something's gone wrong. You remember the preacher's words from last Sunday? Vanity walks long, but never far. He was definitely staring at your shoes when he said it. There were actual laws. In 1463, King Edward IV of England banned shoe points longer than 2 inches for anyone beneath the rank of lord. In Paris, officials launched crackdowns on cobblers who made unauthorized krakows. In Florence, there was a specific tax on long-toed shoes. Imagine trying to explain that line item on your budget. And the punishments? Usually fines. But in some places, shoes were confiscated and burned. That's right, bonfires of the vanities, foot edition. There's even one quirky account from Flanders where offenders were forced to parade barefoot through town holding signs that said, "Vain in step, foolish in head." Brutal. You pause outside the alehouse, watching the crowd. A nobleman passes, his toes practically dragging behind him, fluttering with tiny bells at the tips. No one bats an eye. But when a butcher's apprentice tries the same, the reeve yanks him aside, inspects the shoe length with a wooden ruler, and issues a fine on the spot. This wasn't just about footwear, it was about power. The upper classes didn't want the lower classes walking tall, literally or figuratively. Long shoes made you look more important, more elegant, more dominant. It was a walking illusion of wealth, and illusions were dangerous. There's a fringe theory some scholars toss around, that the pointed shoe trend may have caused widespread foot deformities. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries showing twisted toes and bunions on par with modern high-heel damage. Some have even dubbed it poulain foot. Not exactly a legacy you want for your footwear. So why did people keep wearing them? Because fashion doesn't care about pain, or practicality, or common sense. People wore the shoes to look wealthy, to attract partners, to peacock at festivals. Some even added bells or embroidered tips to draw more attention. There's one story about a courtier in Burgundy who had gold thread stitched into his shoe tips. He tripped during a feast and knocked over a table of oysters. Worth it? Probably not. But like all ridiculous trends, the poulain era eventually died. After decades of bans, mockery, and literal injuries, fashion shifted toward duckbills, wide, flat shoes that made your feet look like paddles. Which, let's be honest, sounds even worse. But hey, at least no one needed to tie their toes to their knees anymore. Still, the legacy of the pointed shoe lingers. Today's stiletto, the 1400s would have had something to say. Cowboy boots? Basically krakows with spurs. And if you've ever worn something that made walking harder but made you feel a little cooler, well, you've already lived a bit of the krakow life. You tuck your feet beneath a bench as a patrol passes, hoping they don't notice the extra inch or two at your toes. Technically, your shoes are legal. Technically. But in a world where your footwear could be considered a criminal offense, even 1 inch too far could be the difference between strutting and stumbling. Better not dance tonight. Not unless you're wearing your humble boots. The tavern grows rowdy as dusk bleeds into full darkness. Candles flicker, tankards clank, laughter spills like cheap ale from every corner. But you're discreetly stuffing your dice into your pouch, eyes darting toward the open window, because the sun has set, and in this town, playing dice after dark isn't just frowned upon, it's forbidden. Not because it's noisy, not because the candles might catch your cloak on fire, but because somewhere between supper and starlight, dice become dangerous. They lead to fights, to ruin, to sins of all stripes. And medieval lawmakers? They didn't trust people with that much temptation once the lamps were lit. Yes, in many parts of medieval Europe, gambling at night was illegal. You lean back on the bench, pretending to enjoy your watered-down ale while two men next to you argue over coin. Earlier, you watched them play for hours, tossing dice across a cracked board, the stakes growing higher with each round. But as soon as the bells rang for evening prayers, the mood changed. Someone whispered, "Curfew's close," and the game scattered like scared pigeons. Why such strict rules? Well, dice games were seen as a moral hazard, especially at night. Gambling, in general, was a touchy subject. The church considered it a sin of idleness, greed, and pride. Add a few pitchers of ale in the cover of darkness, and suddenly you're one unlucky roll away from a knife fight. Town councils weren't just worried about your soul. They were worried about public order. Historians still debate whether these laws were truly about morality or just early crowd control. But the patterns are clear. In towns across England, Germany, France, and the Low Countries, laws banned or tightly restricted dice games, especially after sunset, especially in inns and taverns. In London, the 14th century city ordinances are crystal clear. No dice, no cards, and definitely no hazard. A fast-paced, high-stakes game played with 2 dice. Players shouted phrases like "set on" and "throw bold" as they gambled coin, cloaks, and sometimes entire week's wages. It was addictive, chaotic, and beloved by soldiers, sailors, and shady merchants. So naturally, it became public enemy number 1 for the authorities. You hear a thump behind you. Someone's lost a round of backgammon. Technically, that's allowed, if the stakes stay low. But you know how fast that changes. First it's pennies, then it's silver rings, then it's someone's prized dagger. And then come the knives, the shouting, the reeve at the door. Curfews didn't just apply to gamblers. Many medieval towns had strict rules about when people could be in public. Once the town bell rang, all citizens were expected to be off the streets and back home, unless they had permission, a lantern, or a really convincing excuse. Lawmen patrolled after dark, keeping an eye out for drunkards, thieves, and the inevitable illegal dice game tucked behind a bakery. And it wasn't just about crime. In some towns, gambling was tightly linked to moral panic. A bishop in 13th century Paris once blamed a string of fires on youth corrupted by dice. No evidence, of course, but it sounded good from the pulpit. Others claimed dice were tools of the devil. Every roll a test, every game a step toward damnation. It's kind of impressive, really, how something so small could carry such weight. There's even a fringe law in Lübeck, Germany, that punished excessive gambling by moonlight, with a week's wages and a day in the stocks. Imagine sitting there, tied to a post in the market square, while townsfolk walk by muttering, "Should have folded on 6s, mate." Not all gambling was banned, though. Tournaments and festivals often had exceptions. Regulated games for controlled stakes. Royal courts hosted extravagant gambling sessions. Even some churches held raffles to raise funds. But the key difference? Control. Nighttime games in taverns? Too wild, too risky, too common. You finger the dice in your pouch. Bone worn smooth. A lucky set. They've gotten you through some tight spots, bought you meals, lost you a blanket. Once, they nearly got you punched by a half-blind cooper in Norwich who swore you rolled snake eyes on purpose. You didn't, probably. And here's the kicker. Dice were everywhere. Excavations in medieval towns constantly uncover little six-sided cubes carved from bone, wood, or antler. Some are standard, others are loaded. Yes, cheating was rampant, and laws reflected that too. In Venice, a 15th century statute outlawed false dice and declared that anyone caught using them must wear a sign reading truffatore, cheater, in public for a week. In England, fake dice sellers could be banished from guilds, their stalls destroyed. There's even one quirky case where a merchant accused his rival of enchanting the dice with spells to rig the rolls. The case went to court. The solution? The suspect had to roll the dice 3 times in church. No cheating under holy eyes, apparently. You wonder what magic people believed these little cubes held. Some thought they were cursed, others blessed. A few noblemen even carried personal sets carved from ivory and studded with gems. Because if you're going to ruin your fortune, you may as well do it in style. And then there's the children. Schools and churches banned dice from young hands, fearing early corruption. One monk wrote, "Better to teach a child the Psalms than let his fingers itch for sixes." But you know better. Kids will find a way. You once saw a shoemaker's son rolling pebbles behind a stable, shouting numbers and pretending he had a full purse to wager. You glance out the tavern window. The street is dark now. Torches flicker in wall brackets. Someone slams a door across the square. You shift your pouch deeper into your tunic and quietly exit, careful not to jingle. Not tonight. Because in medieval Europe, a night of dice could cost you more than your coin. It could cost you your freedom, your reputation, even your fingers, if the wrong noble thought you cheated. Better to play in the morning, when the sun's up, when the reeve is sleepy, when your luck feels just a little more lawful. You're out of breath, half running down a forest path, cloak snagging on every branch, heart pounding not from fear but from, of all things, romance. You've just spent a stolen afternoon in a hayloft with someone you're not married to. Scandalous? Sure. Illegal? Oh, absolutely. And not just in the hand-slap way. Because in medieval Europe, unmarried love could get you fined, jailed, or even excommunicated. Especially if someone caught you doing the wrong thing at the wrong time of year. Yes, it's time to talk about seasonal intimacy bans and the many, many laws policing love, desire, and the absurd notion that there's a wrong day to fall for someone. You slow down near a stream, catching your breath as frogs chirp around you. The air is still and thick, and it occurs to you, this might be Lent. Oh no, that makes everything worse. See, in many medieval towns and dioceses, intimacy during certain holy seasons, particularly Lent and Advent, was strictly forbidden, even for married couples. 40 days of abstinence before Easter, another stretch before Christmas. Add in saints' feast days, fasting Fridays, and the occasional superstition about full moons. And there were whole chunks of the calendar where touching your spouse too lovingly could be considered a sin, or worse, a punishable offense. Historians still argue whether these laws were consistently enforced or mostly symbolic. Some suggest they were more like scare tactics, moral speed bumps to keep people in line. Others point to court records where couples were dragged before bishops, accused of carnal excess during holy weeks, and don't even think about being unmarried. In 13th century Paris, unmarried couples caught in flagrante delicto could be forced to marry immediately or face public penance. That meant walking barefoot through town, wearing a shirt made of sackcloth, while everyone threw bits of bread and muttered prayers for your lost dignity. Romantic, right? Then there's the bizarre case of Bishop Grassa Test in Lincoln, England, who reportedly tried to have a young couple exorcised because he believed their premarital passion had invited demons into the parish. Overkill? Probably. But it wasn't unusual for spiritual and legal consequences to blur into one another. There was also a belief, deeply rooted in theology and folk medicine, that certain times were more polluting than others. The idea was that intimacy during periods of spiritual preparation made a person ritually unclean. Some even thought it could warp the soul of a future child conceived during a forbidden season. A popular 14th century guidebook for confessors warned that children born from Lenten unions might be morally feeble or prone to heresy, which seems like a bit much. Of course, enforcement varied wildly. In small villages, priests might issue stern warnings from the pulpit, but look the other way unless someone got pregnant. In cities, things were more bureaucratic. Church courts handled these moral breaches like petty crimes, assigning penance like spiritual parking tickets, 3 Hail Marys for hand-holding, 2 weeks of fasting for anything more. Enthusiastic. You remember hearing about the bed inspectors in some regions. Yes, actual officials tasked with confirming that married couples slept in the same bed and that unmarried people didn't. Their visits were often sudden and awkward. Imagine you're halfway through a meal and someone bangs on your door asking to see where and with whom you sleep. Even worse, some cities had what were essentially morality patrols. In Florence, a unit called the Auto di Guardia roamed the streets, enforcing decency laws and handing out citations for everything from public kisses to winking with suggestive intent. Now, let's not forget the fringe practices. There are scattered reports from rural Italy and southern France of bed bans, enforced not by priests, but by neighbors. In one 14th century village, a woman was tied to her own porch for breaking a Lenten vow of chastity with her husband. The town claimed it was for her own redemption. Sure, totally not revenge because she won last year's harvest dance competition. It gets weirder. Some regions believed that certain times of year made you more susceptible to lustful spirits. In one German town, couples were advised to hang bundles of rosemary and sage above their beds during Advent to ward off demon whispers. Other places banned singing romantic ballads near churches during Lent, worried it might lead to temptation, and one French bishop famously outlawed the color red from being worn by unmarried women during fasting periods. Because if you can't stop the urges, at least control the fashion, right? You smirk, remembering that you're currently wearing a red sash. Oops, but what if you were really in love? Well, you might try to dodge the restrictions by seeking a special marriage license. That meant paying a hefty fee to the church to marry during a prohibited season, often Advent or Lent. These licenses were rare and expensive, reserved for nobility or the desperate. The average peasant, you waited. Sometimes for months, sometimes until after the harvest. There are records of couples betrothed for 3 years before finally marrying, because they couldn't line up a non-prohibited date and an available priest at the same time. Of course, people got creative. Secret marriages, quick roadside unions performed by wandering friars, or a favorite trick in some places, faking a sibling relationship to travel or lodge together. No, sir, we aren't lovers, we're cousins, which probably raised even more eyebrows, come to think of it. Modern scholars have combed through parish logs and court records trying to determine how widespread these seasonal bans were, and the truth is, no one fully agrees. Some places were strict, others performative, and others still, especially in frontier towns or among the very poor, just didn't have the time to police such things. But the laws were real, the shame was real, and for those who broke the rules, the consequences could echo for years. Public penance, denial of church sacraments, in extreme cases, excommunication, all for a moment of passion, poorly timed with the liturgical calendar. You finally reach the edge of the village, breath steadying, cloak soaked with dew. A candle flickers in your sweetheart's window, one short flicker, too long. The signal. You smile. You know the rules. You know the risks. But as with most things in medieval life, law and life don't always agree. And tonight, at least, love wins out over Lent. Just maybe avoid the red sash next time. You wake to the distant clang of a bell. Not a church bell, not the town crier. No, this one has a dull metallic ring that sounds distinctly like a cow wearing a harness, which makes sense since you're about to enter the extremely weird world of livestock lawsuits. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval Europe, animals could be put on trial, formally, legally, and with a straight face. Pigs, cows, horses, even insects. Charged, tried, and sometimes sentenced. You stretch, brush hay from your tunic, and wonder if the cow that kept you up all night mooing was the same one you heard about last week. The one being held in the town jail for murder. Because in some regions, especially parts of France, Switzerland, and Italy, if an animal caused serious harm, it wasn't just seen as a mishap. It was treated like a crime that had to be addressed, documented, and punished according to local laws and the eyes of God. You wander into the square, drawn by a gathering crowd. There it is, a young pig, tethered between two guards, looking surprisingly indifferent to its fate. A monk steps forward, parchment in hand, and reads the charges. This sow, having willfully attacked and slain the infant child of Simon the Fuller, stands accused of murder most foul. No one laughs, because this is a real trial, and the pig is the defendant. Historically, these weren't rare occurrences. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was found guilty of killing a child and was executed in full public ceremony, dressed in human clothing and hung from a gallows. And that wasn't even considered strange at the time. Dozens of court records from the 13th to 16th centuries show animals being given legal representation, judges being assigned, and elaborate trials carried out with full ritual. Historians still argue whether these trials were genuine attempts at justice or elaborate public theater designed to reinforce moral order. But the paper trail is clear. Entire legal systems were willing to go through the motions of justice. For a goat, you edge closer. The pig grunts. The crowd murmurs. A defender is appointed. Yes, someone really does speak on the pig's behalf. Sometimes this was a monk or a low-ranking notary, tasked with arguing that the animal was just acting on instinct or perhaps possessed by a demon, which was, oddly, a legal defense. If the animal was thought to be under satanic influence, the church might decide it wasn't morally culpable and could be exorcised instead of punished. In one Swiss case, a rooster was accused of laying an egg, considered unnatural and suspicious, as roosters are not supposed to do such things. The egg was confiscated, and the rooster was burned alive on suspicion of being in league with the devil. It sounds absurd now, but in the medieval worldview, any departure from natural order was cause for alarm. And animals weren't exempt from that logic. Not all trials ended in death, though. Some animals were acquitted. Others received milder sentences. A bull might be exiled. A dog might be branded. In one especially odd case from 15th century France, a sow that killed a child was executed, but her piglets, who had merely been present, were pardoned due to lack of evidence. Now you're probably wondering, what about bugs? Surely no one tried to prosecute a beetle. Oh, but they did. Welcome to the lesser-known but equally baffling world of insect trials, where entire swarms of pests were summoned to court. In 1546, the people of Saint Julien in France took legal action against weevils that were destroying their crops. A judge was appointed. A formal case was opened. The weevils were issued a summons and given time to appear. Of course they didn't, being weevils. But that didn't stop the trial. In some cases, when the insects failed to comply, they were excommunicated. A bishop would literally declare the pests banished from the land by divine decree. Sometimes a compromise was suggested, a small plot of land set aside for the insects to live in peace away from the main harvest. Whether the weevils respected the arrangement is unclear. You might think this was just rural superstition, but these were formal ecclesiastical courts with clerks, scribes, and seals. The process was meticulous, the language solemn. To the medieval mind, these trials weren't farcical. They were necessary rituals of moral and cosmic balance. There's a fringe belief among some scholars that these animal trials also served as social teaching tools. That is, by watching an animal suffer for its crime, people were reminded of the seriousness of human misbehavior. It was theater, yes, but with sharp teeth. A sow on a scaffold reminded everyone what happens when you break the rules. Still, you have to admit, it's weird. You picture a medieval clerk waking up, stretching, heading to work, and spending the day preparing legal arguments against a caterpillar? Because, yes, even caterpillars were sometimes brought to court, or worms, or rats. Basically anything that ate crops could, in theory, be charged with property destruction. The legal language was flowery and formal. The pests were often addressed in Latin, as if they were fellow citizens. You imagine the weevils nodding politely as the charges are read. Ah, yes, property damage and trespassing. Quite right, sir. And then there's the idea of collective punishment. In many cases, a whole group of animals would be tried for the actions of one. A herd of cows might be slaughtered if one among them gored a nobleman. A family of pigs could be exiled from a village. And if the animals belonged to a peasant, tough luck. Sometimes the owner would be fined and lose the animals. Of course, the nobility weren't always subject to these same rules. Their dogs could maul a beggar and get away with it. Their horses could trample a farmer's field without consequence. But if your cow sneezed near a priest, suddenly it's wearing a rope and standing trial for sacrilegious expulsion of vapors. Okay, That last one's not in the records, but at this point, would it really surprise you? You hang back as the trial winds down. The pig's fate is sealed. Execution by hanging later today. The defender bows his head. The judge solemnly signs the parchment. The pig? Still chewing on a turnip, unaware that it's now a criminal with a scheduled date at the gallows. The crowd disperses. Some shake their heads. Others shrug. A few kids throw pebbles at the stocks. Just another Tuesday in the Middle Ages. And as you walk away, it hits you. This isn't just about pigs or weevils. It's about how deeply people believed in law, order, and cosmic justice. So much so, they were willing to extend it to the animal kingdom, maybe even the insect kingdom. Heck, probably the vegetable kingdom, if anyone ever caught a particularly violent cabbage. It's absurd. It's real. And it's a reminder that justice in medieval Europe was, like its stew, thick, messy, and full of unexpected chunks. You find yourself stepping gingerly along the moss-slick edge of a sleepy village pond, where ducks mutter secret things to each other and the willows lean down like sleepy old women. It seems peaceful enough, tranquil even. But don't be fooled. This pond, this slow swirl of green water, may once have been a stage for trial by ordeal. No judge's bench, no jury box, just water, and whether you float or sink. Because in medieval Europe, God was the judge, and nature, especially water, was believed to be his tool. And when justice got complicated, people turned to it to sort things out, or more precisely, to ordeals, a legal system so strange and terrifying that you almost want to fail just to prove you're innocent. Today's main attraction, the ordeal by water. You're accused of theft, or heresy, or gossiping about the priest's new boots. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that there's no clear evidence, and the village doesn't trust your word alone. So you're bound hand and foot, dragged to the nearest body of water, and lowered in. If you float, you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent, but may drown in the process. Lovely system, right? The logic was twistedly theological. Water was holy, especially when blessed by a priest. And if you floated, it meant the water was rejecting you, refusing to accept your sinful body. If you sank, it was because the water embraced your innocence and took you in. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed this was accurate divine judgment, or if it was just a very public way of reinforcing authority. But either way, the practice was deadly serious. You shiver at the edge of the pond, not just from the cold, but from the memory of whispered stories. Women accused of witchcraft thrown into lakes. Men accused of petty theft, weighted with rocks and pitched off bridges. Survivors often emerged broken, gasping, and half dead. But if they lived, they were usually pardoned because they passed. It wasn't just water, though. There was the ordeal by fire, which is just as pleasant as it sounds. In this one, you're made to carry a red-hot iron bar for a set number of paces. Your hand is then wrapped and inspected 3 days later. If it's healing cleanly, you're innocent. If not, guilty or dead, whichever comes first. Another option, plunging your hand into boiling water, retrieving a stone, and then enduring the same bandaged wait and check process. It's essentially early medicine meets reality TV. Will your hand blister normally or betray your guilt? In one 9th century English case, a man accused of stealing church wine underwent the boiling water ordeal. Miraculously, his hand healed perfectly, But then he got cocky, bragged about cheating the priest, and was promptly re-accused. That second test didn't go so well. Fringe fact, there was even an ordeal by bread and cheese. No joke. This was reserved mostly for clergy. The accused would eat a bit of dry bread and cheese while under the watchful eyes of witnesses. If they choked, turned red, or otherwise reacted strangely, they were presumed guilty. Because guilt, you see, physically reveals itself under sacred snacks. There was also ordeal by cross, where two people stood before a large crucifix with arms raised. First one to drop them loses. And while that sounds more like a low-budget game show than justice, it was a real method used during legal disputes, especially between nobles. Who needs evidence when you can have a holy staring contest? But let's return to your watery doom. By the 12th century, these trials had evolved into pageantry. There were official ceremonies. Priests blessed the water, made the sign of the cross, and recited psalms. The accused was shaved and inspected to make sure they weren't hiding any witch stones or holy relics that might float them unfairly. And the crowd? Oh, they came in droves. It was half justice, half spectacle. You, bound and wide-eyed, were the entertainment. Some records show women being tested more often by water, especially when accused of witchcraft, adultery, or infanticide, charges hard to prove, harder to disprove. The logic went, if she survives the pond, she's a witch. If not, well, she wasn't. Sorry about that. You kneel beside the pond now, peering into the green-black swirl. A frog plops in and vanishes. You imagine the weight of rope around your wrists, the cold shock, the sudden silence of submersion. Do you flail? Do you go limp? And even if you survive, who says the villagers will believe it? Because here's the hidden twist. Passing the ordeal didn't guarantee mercy. Often, it just meant a reduced punishment, or a fine, or exile. Innocence was subjective and sometimes inconvenient. There are cases where someone passed the ordeal only to be retried by more civilized courts. One woman in the 13th century passed the ordeal by water, was declared innocent, and then banished anyway for community discomfort. Translation: the villagers still thought she was creepy. By the 13th century, the church began pulling back from ordeals. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council formally prohibited clergy from participating in trials by fire or water. And without the church's blessing, the rituals lost much of their power. That, plus the rise of jury trials and secular courts, gradually pushed ordeals out of practice. Still, it didn't vanish overnight. Local customs die hard. Some rural regions continued to dunk and scald accused people well into the 14th century. It took centuries and a lot of court reform before ordeals were finally replaced with something resembling modern justice. You glance one last time at the pond, it's still sun-dappled, peaceful. But now, in your mind, you see ghosts, faces peeking through the surface, eyes wide with hope or terror or nothing at all. The water has a long memory, and maybe, just maybe, it still whispers the names of those who couldn't swim fast enough to escape belief. You rise, brushing dirt from your knees, and leave the pond behind, not because you're afraid, but because some things, especially truth and justice, don't always float. The wind has picked up, a low, rattling sort of breeze that stirs the flags atop the manor and shuffles dry leaves across the cobbles. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders as you near the city gates, not because it's cold, but because you're about to enter a realm where the walls don't just protect the city. They enforce some of the strangest laws you've ever heard. You glance up at the archway. On one side is a stone carving of a knight holding a sword. On the other, a monk with a scroll. Between them, a tiny inscription in fading Latin. It reads, Nullus asinus habeat calceamenta. No donkey shall wear shoes. Yes, you are now entering a town where donkey footwear was strictly forbidden. You don't laugh, not out loud anyway, because, strange as it sounds, this was a real medieval ordinance in parts of England and France. The logic? Some scholars believe it was meant to prevent owners from disguising donkeys as horses, to dodge certain taxes or stable fees. Others think it was about noise control. Shoed donkeys were too loud on cobblestones. Historians still argue whether this rule was actually enforced or simply symbolic of larger class issues around livestock ownership. But that's just the start. As you cross the gate, you enter a society micromanaged by laws so oddly specific they feel made up. Like how, in 14th century Chester, it was illegal to carry a fish through the street after sunset unless you were the town fishmonger, not sell fish. Carry fish. The reason? To prevent under-the-table sales and protect guild profits. Black market cod was apparently a pressing concern. Guilds were everything here. Tight-knit trade organizations with the power to make or break careers. And they had rules. Wild ones. Like in certain weavers' guilds, apprentices weren't allowed to whistle while they worked, lest it distract others or suggest they weren't focused. In some bakers' guilds, adding extra raisins to your own loaf, without permission, could land you a fine. Or a public shaming involving flour sacks and a donkey ride. You stop at the market square and notice a small sign nailed to a post. No pigs without nose rings. Yep, another actual law. In parts of medieval England, pigs were allowed to roam the streets to scavenge scraps, but only if they had a metal ring through their nose to prevent rooting through gardens. A pig caught unringed was subject to seizure or execution. Try explaining that one to your kids. Mommy's pig is gone because he dug up the mayor's tulips. But don't laugh too hard. Some of these laws were serious business. In medieval Bologna, it was illegal to wear a sword, unless you were part of a recognized militia or had noble status. Makes sense for public safety, right? But enforcement was tricky. So they issued sword licenses and forgot to standardize them, which led to a roaring black market in forged documents. So they passed a new law. No one may carry a sword unless the hilt bears his family crest in gold, which, of course, led to gold paint vendors offering emergency noble hilting in back alleys. The line between absurdity and cleverness was razor thin. And don't even get started on sumptuary laws, the deeply weird rules about what you could and couldn't wear. These laws weren't about fashion. They were about keeping everyone in their social lane. For example, in 1363, England passed a statute declaring that no man below the rank of knight could wear velvet, satin, or ermine. And women? The wife of a merchant might be allowed a small fur trim, but only if her husband paid a certain tax. You were literally taxed for trying to look fancy. There were tailors fined for making sleeves too long and flowing, and shoemakers banned from crafting shoes with excessively pointy toes, called poulaines. that could reach up to 18 inches long. One law required all poulains longer than 6 inches to be tied to the shin with a ribbon, lest the wearer trip in church. You stroll past a cobbler's shop and eye a worn diagram of legal shoe lengths scratched into the wall, half a foot for peasants, up to 10 inches for merchants, 12 for knights. Anything longer, only for lords and the very brave. Even more niche. Some towns banned people from wearing bright green unless it was spring. Why? No idea. Historians chalk it up to either superstition or a coordinated attempt by a very opinionated color guild. You pass a young man being lightly scolded by a constable for whistling near the church steps, another old ordinance still half enforced by tradition. The rule stems from a time when people believed music outside the church tempted demons or distracted those inside. The constable finishes his lecture, pats the boy on the head, and walks off muttering about the decline of decorum. Then there's one of the strangest laws of all, the swearing pig rule. In several towns, including 14th century Lubeck, if a pig wandered into court proceedings and made a noise during sentencing, it was considered a divine interruption. Depending on the tone of the grunt, some jurists believed it was an omen of innocence or guilt. Pigs, apparently, were medieval lie detectors. You can't make this stuff up, except someone did, in law form, on parchment. Of course, enforcement was spotty. Just because a law was written didn't mean it was used. Many were symbolic or meant to intimidate or passed hastily in response to one bizarre incident. Like the time a man in York rode a goose through the market and caused a riot. Result? No geese may serve as mounts in public space. Probably used exactly once. Others lasted for generations. In some cities, a bell had to be rung if a woman was being publicly punished, so passers-by wouldn't accidentally witness the shame. In one part of Italy, people were required by law to salute any statue of the Virgin Mary they passed, and failing to do so 3 times could result in public penance. You pass a fountain where a sign still reads, "Do not bathe chickens after Vespers." Whether the chicken's mind remains unclear. But here's the strangest part. Many of these laws weren't meant to be cruel. They were attempts, however weird, to create order in a chaotic world. With cities growing, markets expanding, and class boundaries constantly shifting, local councils were desperate to keep things stable. Sometimes that meant banning green shirts or regulating raisin density. And some laws were surprisingly progressive. In a few places, women could own businesses, sign contracts, and even prosecute men in court if they followed a prescribed dress code and spoke through a legal mail. Strange equality, but more freedom than you might expect. You duck into an alley where the wind quiets down. A ragged poster flaps against a wall. It's old, faded, and mostly illegible, but you can just make out one line. No barrel may be rolled east after dusk unless accompanied by song. It's oddly beautiful, really. A reminder that once upon a time someone believed that law and music could walk hand in hand, that a rolled barrel without a tune was a disruption, that a weevil in court deserved a lawyer, that water might tell the truth better than any man. You smile and keep walking, careful not to whistle or carry a fish. You rub your eyes, blinking against the glow of a lantern hanging from a crooked iron hook. The flickering light dances across the cobbled alley where shadows bend around rain barrels and sagging door frames. You're deep in the city now. the kind of place where whispers linger longer than they should and truth wears 1,000 masks. And speaking of masks, you've finally reached the topic that's been itching at your curiosity all night. Trial by ordeal, those charming little medieval truth tests where your guilt or innocence was decided by how well you handled, say a handful of boiling iron. You duck beneath a wooden awning and lean against the wall. Above you, a carved wooden sign swings gently in the breeze. Ordeal Alley, Este, 1197. You can't tell if it's an actual landmark or just an extremely committed local joke. Either way, this is where justice got weird. Because in a world before forensics, lie detectors, or video footage, truth wasn't found. It was proven, often through pain, spectacle, or both. Let's start with the infamous ordeal by hot iron. The process was brutal but simple. You'd walk several paces carrying a red-hot iron bar, usually weighing about 3 pounds. Then your burned hand would be bound and inspected 3 days later. If it was healing cleanly, congratulations, innocent. If it festered or looked angry, guilty. Modern logic might ask, wouldn't everyone's hand fester? But that's where things get interesting, because according to some scholars, there's a theory that priests administering the ordeal may have quietly helped certain accused parties, like heating the iron slightly less, or using herbal salves during the bandaging. Historians still argue whether the trials were rigged or if psychological pressure could cause real physical changes. A medieval placebo effect, if you will. Your brain, believing in divine justice, might have actually helped your body heal better. Or maybe it was just sheer dumb luck. Either way, the stakes? Not great. And don't think iron was the only option. Some poor souls faced ordeal by water, a real crowd pleaser. The accused would be bound and tossed into a river or pond. If they sank, they were innocent. If they floated, guilty. You can almost hear the logic chugging along. Pure water rejects the sinful, while the pure are absorbed. The issue? People float, especially when bound tightly with rope, but not always. Variability in weight, clothing, water salinity, and how panicked you were all played a role. And yes, people drowned. Technically innocent, but still dead. You shift on your feet, imagining being tied up and dunked into a muddy river, while a crowd of neighbors watches, some probably eating snacks, maybe cheering, maybe placing bets. Other ordeals were even more niche. There was ordeal by cold water in some Germanic regions. Same idea, different temperature. Or the delightfully obscure ordeal of the cross, where 2 people stood with their arms outstretched like a crucifix until one dropped from exhaustion. The last one standing was deemed more truthful. So yes, your court case could be decided by who had stronger triceps. Let's not forget ordeal by firewalking, used mostly in early medieval France and parts of Scandinavia. Accused individuals had to walk barefoot over hot coals, then their feet were wrapped and examined later. Healing well? Innocent? Infection? Guilty. You're starting to see a pattern, aren't you? And then there's ordeal by Morcel. This one's a sleeper hit, used among the nobility and clergy. You were given a large, dry piece of bread and cheese and told to recite a prayer while chewing and swallowing. If you choked, coughed, or spat it out, clearly guilty, because divine punishment or poor hydration. You glance into a dark corner where a half-collapsed wooden scaffold still clings to the stone wall. Someone scrawled, "Justice is dry cheese," in charcoal across the planks. You nod, deeply profound. In most cases, ordeals were overseen by clergy, and while some priests likely believed in divine judgment, others began to grow uneasy with the whole spectacle. By the 13th century, the Church started pulling away. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council officially banned clerics from participating in ordeals, effectively killing the practice in most of Europe. But before that, ordeals weren't just normal. They were the gold standard of justice. And yet, not all ordeals were painful or deadly. One fringe but real variation was the trial by consecrated bread, used when clergy themselves were accused. If the accused could safely consume the holy bread without choking, they were cleared. This one's less about danger and more about superstition. Still, awkward if you had a dry throat or stage fright. And here's a curious twist. Sometimes people demanded ordeal trials, especially the innocent, because in a time when witnesses were unreliable and local lords could be easily bribed, some believed that only the divine could truly judge. If you were lucky and had a sympathetic priest, an ordeal could actually be your best shot. You shake your head, picturing a barefoot baker muttering prayers while crossing hot coals, followed by a scribe writing "innocent" in delicate ink as a crowd disperses. One of the most legendary ordeals? The story of Queen Emma of Normandy, mother to Edward the Confessor. Accused of adultery in the 11th century, she reportedly underwent the ordeal of fire, walking barefoot over glowing plowshares. She emerged unscathed, her innocence declared. Did it happen? Maybe. Maybe not. Historians still debate the tale's authenticity, but the myth endured, powerful, dramatic, and oddly comforting. And of course, some ordeals were deeply local. In parts of Eastern Europe, communities practiced ordeals by boiling water. You'd reach into a pot and retrieve a stone from the bottom. 3 days later, the priest would inspect your arm. Healing? Innocent. Swollen and blistered? Guilty. There's one recorded case where the accused dipped their arm in, screamed, and immediately confessed to 2 unrelated crimes out of sheer panic. Efficient, if brutal. Yet, for all their horror, trials by ordeal were meant to create a kind of moral clarity, a divine thumb on the scale. They were a form of surrender, not to law, but to fate. And strangely, they worked, not in the sense of justice always being served, but in the sense that people believed in them. Fear of ordeal was often enough to prompt confessions, and belief in divine justice offered psychological peace in a world without certainty. You step away from the wall, noticing a tiny iron plate bolted at shoulder height. It's worn smooth from centuries of fingers touching it. Locals say it's the remains of an old trial post, where accused townsfolk would rest their hand after walking the hot iron path. You touch it briefly. Cool now, safe, but you imagine it once glowed red-hot in the eyes of the fearful and the innocent alike. And for just a second, you wonder, if you were ever accused of something terrible, would you have stepped forward? Would you have carried the iron? The gravel crunches beneath your boots as you move beyond the alley and into open countryside. Morning mist curls across the fields like sighs from the earth itself, blanketing the hedgerows in a kind of dreamy hush. And it's in that mist, somewhere between sleep and waking, that sumptuary laws begin to take shape. Ah, yes, dress codes, but not the kind where your school tells you to tuck in your shirt or skip the crop top. No, this was medieval Europe. Here, what you wore wasn't just fashion, it was law. Picture this. You're a humble merchant who's finally made enough money to afford a velvet doublet. Exciting, right? You stroll into the market, sleeves puffed, belt jingling, and suddenly, wham! You're fined or worse. Why? Because you dared to dress above your station. Sumptuary laws were all about maintaining the visible social hierarchy. Your clothing had to reflect your class, your income, and sometimes even your marital status. These laws were obsessed with materials, colors, styles, each a flashing neon sign of who you were allowed to be. And if you strayed outside those boundaries, it wasn't just fashion faux pas, it was a crime. The logic was simple, if bizarre. By dressing according to your status, you reinforced divine order. Kings wore ermine, peasants wore wool. No gray areas, literally. In fact, in England under Edward III, you couldn't wear fur unless you earned over $100 a year. And that's a lot of chickens. Historians still argue whether the laws were strictly enforced or mostly symbolic, but records show people were fined, shamed, and even excommunicated for what they wore, and not just nobles. Tailors were punished for making the wrong garments for the wrong clients. And heaven forbid you tried to fake nobility. In some parts of France, if you wore silk without the royal right, you'd be paraded through town in your offending outfit, and then it would be cut to shreds on your body while the crowd jeered. Just a little fashion critique with a side of humiliation. The obsession ran deep. In Florence during the 14th century, city officials kept meticulous records of clothing inspections. Seriously, they had entire departments tracking who wore what. There's one surviving list with actual measurements of sleeve width, because too much fabric meant you were living above your means. Let that sink in. Your sleeves could rat you out. You paused by a low stone wall and looked down at your arms. You're safe for now. But if you were wearing too much blue, that would have been a problem in England. Blue dyes were expensive, especially indigo, reserved for upper classes. If you were a miller or a baker and showed up in royal blue, suspicious. Or red, deep crimson red, made from crushed kermes insects, was a regal color. Think cardinals, kings, and very annoyed tax collectors. Want to wear it as a grocer? That's going to cost you more than just the fabric. One particularly petty law from 1363 England declared that no one under the rank of knight could wear certain fabrics like silk or imported wool. And if you were in the clergy, you couldn't wear anything gaudy or fluttering. There were even length laws. Yes, like medieval miniskirt bands. If your tunic was too short or too long, it could suggest vanity or worse, wealth you weren't supposed to have. Even shoes weren't safe. Let's talk about poulaines, those ridiculous pointy shoes that curved up like a slide. Stylish, absurd, and deeply scandalous. At their peak, poulaines could be 2 feet long, curled like a party horn. And so naturally, sumptuary laws arrived to measure them. By 1463, England passed a law restricting how long your toe extensions could be, depending on your status. Imagine the job. Royal toe inspector. Someone out there probably had to carry a stick and say, "Sorry, sir, but your shoe is 5 inches too noble." And here's a juicy fringe tidbit. Prostitutes in some cities were required by law to wear distinctive clothing, like yellow veils in Florence or striped cloaks in England, so they couldn't be confused with respectable women. Historians still debate whether this was meant as public health policy, moral judgment, or just convenient visual branding. Meanwhile, noblewomen had their own codes. In France, you couldn't wear a horned headdress unless you were titled, and some places dictated how much jewelry you could wear at a time. 1 ring? Fine. 12 rings, jeweled belt, and pearl-studded hood? Someone's getting fined. Sumptuary laws weren't just about fashion. They were economic tools, too. Monarchs wanted to control the import of luxury goods, especially from places like China, Persia, or the Ottoman Empire. Silk, for instance, was a major obsession. Laws often aimed to protect domestic industries by banning foreign silks, but that didn't stop people from smuggling or secretly commissioning banned outfits. In one recorded case, a noblewoman in 15th century Venice was found wearing 6 layers of illegal fabric, hidden beneath a modest overdress. Her excuse? It's chilly. The authorities weren't amused. You glance up at a crow perched on a crumbling chimney. It ruffles its wings and caws, clearly unimpressed with human attempts to regulate color and cloth. Nature doesn't do hierarchy, but the medieval mind did. The tighter the social structure, the more urgent it became to visibly mark your place in it. But here's the strangest part. Despite all the laws, people still pushed boundaries. Tailors worked in secret. Merchants bribed inspectors, and sumptuary violations became a strange kind of social performance. "Look at me," they seemed to say. "I know I'm not supposed to wear this, but I can." That tension between conformity and rebellion? Timeless. So, what happens if you travel back and get caught wearing the wrong thing? Well, best case, a fine. Worst case, public shaming. And don't think you could argue ignorance. Laws were posted in town squares, read aloud at church, and sometimes even stitched into legal garments themselves, like little textile warnings. Eventually, as Europe edged into the Renaissance and then the early modern period, these laws lost their teeth. Commerce grew, the middle class expanded, and luxury became harder to police. By the 17th century, sumptuary laws were mostly symbolic. But in the height of the medieval age, clothing was as much a weapon as a sword. You brush a hand down your shirt, checking the fabric. It's soft, functional, no gold embroidery. You'd pass unnoticed here. But imagine the thrill and danger of walking into a medieval feast in scarlet velvet, dripping with illegal pearls, and claiming your place at the high table. Just for a moment. Just to see what would happen. You trail your fingers along a weathered stone wall, still warm from the afternoon sun. The scent of rosemary drifts on the air, stirred by a lazy breeze. It's the kind of moment that feels suspended in time. But don't let the calm fool you. Beneath the herbs and old stone lies another strange corner of medieval life, one governed by rules so detailed, so oddly specific, you might think they were made up on the spot. Today, you stumble into the world of weirdly specific food laws and the very real consequences of ignoring them. You're hungry, obviously. You duck into a tiny thatched tavern tucked between crooked houses. The smell of barley stew, roast eel, and pickled cabbage hits you like a delicious punch. But before you touch a spoon, beware. What you're allowed to eat, how much, when, and with whom, might be dictated by the law, or just as often, by religious command. Because in medieval Europe, food wasn't just food. It was morality, status, and often punishment. Let's start with meat, the most controversial item on your plate. Meat was loaded with symbolism, rich, bloody, hot, everything the church loved to warn about, which is why many days of the year were off limits for eating it. During Lent, no meat. Fridays, no meat. Certain saints' days, you guessed it, bread, fish, or fasting. But what counts as meat? Now we hit the loophole buffet. You see, medieval people were nothing if not creative. Take the humble beaver, furry, semi-aquatic, tail like a paddle, not exactly a salmon. And yet, in many parts of Europe, beaver was classified as fish, which meant it was totally okay to roast up a beaver tail stew on Fridays. Historians still argue whether this classification was ever officially accepted by the church or just something communities sort of agreed on. Either way, Beaver Fridays were a thing, and it doesn't stop there. Otters? Also fish? Puffins? Definitely fish, because they lived on cliffs and swam well. Even barnacle geese, which medieval folks believed hatched from driftwood or grew from barnacles, were classified as seafood. The logic: they didn't lay eggs like normal birds, so clearly they must be fish, right? You chuckle. But these weren't fringe beliefs. Monasteries along the coast served these fish birds to keep up appearances of religious obedience while still enjoying a fatty feast. It's spiritual loopholing at its finest. Then there were price control laws. If you were a vendor in a city like London or Paris, what you charged for food was closely monitored. Sell your bread too expensive? Fined. Water down your ale? Public shaming. Add too little meat to your pies? You could literally be put in the stocks with a sign around your neck reading, "Cheated customers." One actual recorded case involves a fishmonger who stuffed rotten fish inside fresh-looking ones to sell them at full price. When discovered, the punishment wasn't a quiet fine. Nope. He was dragged through the streets in a cart full of fish guts while children threw eel skins at him. The message: don't mess with someone's dinner. And then, of course, there were guild rules. If you baked bread, you were part of the Bakers' Guild. If you made cheese, the Cheesemakers' Guild. Each guild had its own set of strict and often very odd codes. Like how many poppy seeds could be sprinkled on a loaf, or exactly how yellow a cheese wheel could be before it was considered fraudulent. One baker in Cologne was nearly jailed for using imported sesame seeds, which weren't allowed in local markets because they disturbed trade balance and tempted the unworthy. That's right. Tempting seeds were illegal, and the rules didn't just apply to sellers. Even who could eat what mattered. In many places, sumptuary laws extended to food. Yes, like the clothing restrictions you just learned about. A merchant could only serve certain meats at feasts. A commoner couldn't serve swan, even if he somehow acquired one. Certain spices, like saffron, cinnamon, or clove, were reserved for nobility or religious festivals. It was illegal for the lower classes to even smell like they were rich. You probably didn't expect spice police on this journey, but yes, they existed. There's a recorded case of a woman in Avignon who was fined after a neighbor smelled nutmeg in her pastry and reported her. When questioned, she admitted her brother had brought it from Spain, and she wanted to try it just once. The result? She was forced to scrub the city market stalls for a week, wearing a sign that read, "Abused flavor." Now let's talk feasting laws. Because if food is tied to morality and class, then how you feast becomes a public performance of virtue. or vice. Some towns limited the number of courses you could serve at weddings. Not guests, courses. Serve more than 3? You'd be seen as trying to compete with your betters. One noble in Milan was reprimanded for having dancing bears at dessert, which apparently was 2 levels too extravagant for someone of his rank. Weddings, wakes, and even baptisms had food quotas. In fact, in 14th century England, there was a law stating that funeral meals for non-nobles couldn't include more than 2 meats, 1 poultry, and 1 dessert. Yes, there were official death menu limits, and if you were poor, things were stricter still. In some cities, you weren't allowed to buy wheat bread during shortages. You had to settle for horse bread, made with ground peas, bran, and sometimes tree bark. Officials would actually patrol bakeries, inspecting who was buying what, making sure no commoner walked off with the good stuff. But even with all these laws, people found ways to cheat the system. You might sneak spices in through the hem of your tunic, or bribe a monk for fish on a non-fish day. One creative cook in Prague was caught serving pork disguised as fish by shaping it into a carp and coating it in fish scales. It worked until a guest found a pig tooth in their bowl. Then there's the fringe belief in magical food prohibitions. In some regions, people believed eating eels on certain days could curse you with insomnia, or that eating eggs during a lunar eclipse would scramble your dreams. Not laws exactly, but strong enough taboos that breaking them could lead to community punishment or exile. You take a moment to sit on a tree stump by a crooked wooden sign that reads, "Toll for ale inspection, 2 farthings." You can't help but wonder what modern foodies would do in this world. No avocados unless you're a knight. No chili unless it's Lent. And sushi? Forget it. Raw fish and seaweed. The Inquisition would have something to say. Still, for all the absurdity, these laws reveal something surprisingly human: the eternal dance between control and desire, between those who write the rules and those who find clever ways to season around them. Your stomach growls again, but maybe, just maybe, you'll hold off on that suspicious-looking pie. You never know when someone might measure your cinnamon. You rub your hands together for warmth, breath puffing out in soft clouds as you step into the shadow of the village church. The bells have long since stopped ringing, but something about the place feels watchful, and not just because of the ever-glaring stone saints perched in their niches above the doorway. You're not here to pray. You're here to look up at the weathered wooden beam just outside the door. A hook still dangles from it, rusted with time and rain. Once, it held something a bit more unnerving than a lantern or a flower pot. A lock, a chain, sometimes a human being. Tonight, you meet the poor souls punished not with prison or fines, but with public shaming devices, those humble and frankly humiliating contraptions designed to embarrass, mock, and, let's be honest, entertain. Let's start with the pillory, not to be confused with the stocks. Both are wooden frames that trap your limbs, yes, but the pillory secures your head and hands, forcing you to stand upright in the village square, usually near the market where everyone could get a good look. You're not just trapped, you're displayed like a cautionary tale with a face. The medieval crowd doesn't need much prompting. They gather, jeering, tossing whatever's at hand. Turnips, spoiled milk, horse dung, if they're particularly inspired. There's no privacy in punishment, and definitely no dignity. But the pillory was only the beginning. There were scold's bridles, also known as branks, heavy iron masks locked around the head of someone, usually a woman, accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking out of turn. Some had metal tongues or spikes that sat against the real tongue, making speech painful or impossible. Imagine being forced to parade through town, your face caged like a snarling beast, for the crime of complaining about your neighbor's soup. Historians still argue whether branks were widespread or mostly symbolic, intimidation tools more than daily devices. But enough examples survive in museums to make you wince. And there are written accounts, too, often chillingly casual in tone. One describes a woman in 17th century Scotland made to wear a scold's bridle for excessive and untamed speaking of slanderous things. What was the slander? She'd accused a baker of shorting his loaves. Sometimes being right just wasn't enough. You shift uncomfortably and step into the street where another oddity lies underfoot, an iron ring set into the cobbles. You've seen them before, scattered in older parts of town. These are cucking stools, used to dunk people, again mostly women, accused of being quarrelsome or disrespectful. Tied to the seat, they'd be dunked into a pond or river repeatedly, soaked and shivering under the cheers, or cruel jokes, of onlookers. And yes, it's the origin of the phrase, getting the cold shoulder. Though technically meant to shame the unruly, these punishments had another purpose, reinforcing obedience. You were punished not just for what you did, but for who you were. Women seen as too outspoken, tradesmen who worked without guild approval, even butchers who sold meat on a Sunday might get a morning in the pillory. There's a strange blend of justice and theater here. Punishment wasn't enough. It had to be visible, loud, memorable. Because in a society where literacy was rare, spectacle was the textbook. One of the weirdest punishments? Try the shame flute. You blink. Yes, you heard that right. The shame flute was an actual instrument-shaped metal device locked around the neck and fingers of bad musicians, yes, musicians, who performed poorly or out of tune in public. The fingers were clamped as if playing a flute, but the instrument was made of iron and couldn't be played. Then the unlucky artist would be marched through town while everyone sang ironically off-key in mockery. You can't make this stuff up. There's a fringe theory that some versions of the shame flute doubled as noisemakers, rattling or screeching when moved. More cowbell? Definitely not. And if you think these punishments were short-term, think again. Some were multi-day affairs. A baker who cheated customers might be placed in the pillory for 3 market days, their face slowly burning in the sun, while the townsfolk passed by over and over again. Others were sentenced to the donkey parade, riding backwards on a donkey through town, sometimes in costume, while someone beat a drum beside them. Sound funny? Sure, but if it's your dignity on that donkey, it hits different. One particularly memorable law in 15th century France stated that a butcher caught selling diseased meat must carry the carcass through town wearing a necklace made of spoiled sausages. Talk about making a stink. Yet, for all the embarrassment, the point was deeper. Public punishment was meant to reset the social balance. You humiliated someone so they, and others, would remember their place. You punished one person to control a whole crowd. Of course, not all shaming was legal. Some was just traditional. Like the charivari, a raucous, mocking parade thrown when people in the village broke unwritten rules. Say an older widow married a much younger man, or a man married a woman known for arguing. The village would gather pots, pans, horns, and bells, then march through town, making as much noise as possible outside the couple's home, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. No official charges, no court orders, just pure, unfiltered peer pressure. People tried to fight back. Some fled towns. Others bribed officials to avoid public punishment. A few even wrote complaints and pleas for mercy, which still survive in archives. One merchant begged not to be pilloried for shorting a loaf of bread, claiming he'd lost his thumb in a mill accident and couldn't measure properly. Did it work? Records don't say. But the image of a man trying to measure flour with one hand, sweating under the threat of public shame, kind of sticks with you. There's one final device worth noting, the shame sign. Not everyone was chained or dunked. Some were simply forced to wear placards around their necks declaring their crime. Gossip, liar, cheat, thief. It's like a medieval version of posting your worst mistake on social media, except you can't log off or delete it. You just walk around hoping no one spits on your shoes. And in a society where your reputation could mean everything, a few hours of shame could ruin your future, your business, even your chance of marriage. You sit on a stone bench near the square, watching the shadows lengthen. It's quiet now. No pillories, no branks, no drum-beating parades. But the echoes are still there. You wonder what modern punishments would look like if shame were still so physical. A walk of shame with your failed math test pinned to your coat? Public stocks for those who leave passive-aggressive comments online? Maybe we haven't come all that far. After all, embarrassment still works. It's just more digital now. But here, in this quiet village square with its forgotten hooks and rings, you can still feel the weight of a society that believed justice must be seen to be believed. Your feet crunch over frosty ground as you wander past the village green, heading toward the edge of town. You're following a path that once led to somewhere most people tried to avoid at all costs, the edge of law, literally and figuratively, because tonight you're stepping into the strange, muddy world of medieval outlawry, not the sword-swinging Robin Hood kind you've seen in movies, but the real, legally enforced vanishing act. You're about to become, in the eyes of the court, a non-person. It starts simple enough. You commit a crime, maybe you stole a sheep, insulted a noble, or skipped your court date one too many times. The local officials try to summon you, perhaps multiple times, but you don't show. You disappear into the woods or slip into a neighboring village under a false name. That's when the real punishment begins. You're declared an outlaw. Now, this isn't just someone on the run. No, being legally outlawed meant you were placed outside the protection of the law itself. That's right. If someone hurt you or even killed you, no court would punish them. Because as far as the law was concerned, you didn't exist anymore. Think of it like being unfriended by an entire kingdom. Harsh? Absolutely. But surprisingly common in medieval Europe, especially in places like Anglo-Norman England or the Germanic territories where outlawry was an official sentence, not just a fate. In Old English, the phrase used was ut legatus, meaning outside the law. Some scholars believe it had earlier Norse roots from the Viking days, where exile and banishment were considered more merciful than execution. After all, death ends you, But outlawry erases you. But here's the thing. Outlawry wasn't always immediate. There was a whole bureaucratic process. You had to be summoned multiple times. The town crier might shout your name at the local crossroads or market. Sometimes a horn was blown as a symbolic last call, one last chance to come forward. If you didn't, the sheriff would declare you officially banished. And then anyone could do what they liked with you. Even your property could be seized. If you had land, animals, tools, those were up for grabs. Your spouse might be pressured to remarry. Your children declared illegitimate. You become a cautionary tale, a ghost in your own lifetime. Historians still argue whether these punishments were enforced as brutally as the laws allowed. Some believe outlawry was more symbolic, especially in tight-knit villages where everyone knew each other. Others insist that these declarations often led to vigilante violence, especially if the outlaw had enemies or owed someone money. You pause under a twisted oak tree scanning the shadows. In the distance, there's an old stone foundation, maybe once a cottage, now just mossy rubble. It could have belonged to someone who disappeared, fled, or was outlawed. In many places, especially rural ones, outlawry was a kind of slow execution. You couldn't get help. No one could feed you. You couldn't appeal to the courts if wronged. And if you were caught, some regions allowed your captor to kill you on the spot. No trial needed. Of course, some outlaws didn't go quietly. You've heard of the famous ones, Robin Hood, Fulk Fitzwarren, William Wallace. But those are legends steeped in romance and rebellion. The average outlaw, they were just trying to stay alive, often hiding in forests, surviving on stolen vegetables, and hoping no one recognized them. There are records of outlaw bands forming in remote woods, groups of fugitives banding together for safety. Sometimes they became bandits. Other times they lived quietly, working in secret on farms or selling goods in disguised markets. There's a curious 13th century English record of an entire outlaw village in Yorkshire, described as a hidden hamlet of disobedient men living outside the peace. One particularly quirky outlaw story involves a monk named Brother Dunstan, who was outlawed for abandoning his monastery and stealing relics. Instead of hiding, he set up a roadside chapel and charged pilgrims for blessed protection on their travels. Essentially, he turned his outlaw status into a business. Fringe historians still debate whether Dunstan was a rogue or a genius, possibly both. And then there were the Greenwood marriages. When a man and woman were both declared outlaw, they might run off together and start a life in the forest, away from society. Some folklore treats these as romantic, rebellious unions. But in reality, it was more survival than sentiment. You remember hearing about the year and a day rule. In many jurisdictions, if an outlaw wasn't captured within that time, they were declared dead in law, literally written out of existence. Their name would be struck from rolls, debts erased. It was as though they'd never lived. But in some towns, if the outlaw returned after a year and a day, they could request replevin, a kind of legal do-over. Basically, hey, I know I vanished, but I'm back now. Can we talk? Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. You head up the slope, imagining yourself walking into a medieval village after a year in hiding. Would they recognize you? Spit at you? Or just quietly look away? It wasn't always bad, though. There are stories, albeit rare, of outlaws being pardoned. A noble might need fighters. A town might lack a skilled blacksmith. In moments of desperation, even the law made exceptions. You see this in the 100 Years' War, when English kings sometimes recruited outlaws into their armies, offering them pardons in exchange for military service. Fight for the crown, and all your crimes are forgotten. Modern governments still do this, by the way, just without the pillories and forest hideouts. But outlawry wasn't just for criminals. Sometimes political dissenters were labeled as outlaws. Speak against the wrong bishop? Suggest the king was overreaching? Suddenly, you're on the outside looking in. Some scholars argue this tactic was a tool of social control, criminalizing dissent under the guise of legal punishment. You kick at a patch of moss, wondering how many stories have been lost, how many names were spoken aloud one final time, then never again. And then there's the concept of sanctuary, a rare lifeline. If you reached a church, literally crossed the threshold, you could claim protection. For 40 days, you were safe. Priests fed you. Guards couldn't touch you. It was a legal loophole, a divine timeout. But after 40 days, you had two choices: stand trial or confess and agree to exile. If you chose exile, you were given a staff, a robe, and a designated road to walk out of the kingdom. You were watched, you were marked, and if you ever returned, the law would finish what it started. One recorded case tells of a man in Lincoln who claimed sanctuary, but tried to sneak back into town in disguise a month later. He made it as far as the fish market before someone recognized his nose, apparently large enough to warrant mention in court records. He was dragged back and hanged the next day. Harsh? Yes, but that's what being outside the law meant. No safety, no sympathy, and absolutely no second chances. Unless the king liked your story, you trace your fingers along a bit of ruined wall, perhaps all that's left of someone who vanished one day, leaving no record but a mossy stone and a gap in a census. Because outlawry wasn't just punishment, it was erasure, a medieval delete button pressed by the very society that once called you neighbor. You sit on a wooden bench outside the guild hall, stretching your sore arms after a long day of hammering copper. Inside, the town's craft guild is holding one of its monthly meetings, and you're technically not allowed in. Not yet. You're only an apprentice, and apprentices aren't given full access to guild affairs. But you've heard whispers through the door, stories of rules so bizarre they sound more like tavern gossip than official regulations. You know that medieval guilds controlled everything from the quality of bread to the size of belt buckles. But what they didn't advertise quite so loudly were the incredibly strange rules they enforced on their members. Some were strict, some were petty, and a few were downright surreal. One rule from a London shoemakers' guild: if a member was caught making shoes on Sundays or holy days, not only would he be fined, he'd be forced to donate those shoes to the poor and stand in the market square, holding them up like a naughty child showing his broken toy. Medieval justice had flair. Another rule, whispered through the door just now, involved beard length. That's right. One guild in Bohemia regulated how long a member's beard could be. Too short? You were trying to look like a priest. Too long? You were a show-off just right. You were safe until fashion changed next season. You see, guilds weren't just about craft. They were about control. Control over competition, reputation, wages, even personal behavior. If you were a baker, you couldn't bake too much or too little. A blacksmith couldn't sell foreign-style horseshoes without permission. And if you were a tailor, heaven help you if your stitching pattern didn't match the guild-approved model. One stitch too many, and suddenly you're in violation of Section 9, Clause 3, flourish infringement. Historians still argue whether these guild laws were meant to preserve quality or just suppress innovation. Some say guilds preserved centuries-old traditions. Others argue they stifled creativity and punished anyone who colored outside the lines. Take the wool weavers of Florence, for example. In the 14th century, they outlawed the use of certain dyes unless you had a license. Why? Because the guild wanted only certain colors to be associated with authentic Florentine cloth. A weaver who used a banned shade of blue could face fines, exile from the city, or worse, a year's worth of forced labor in the dye pits. Hope you like the smell of fermented indigo. Or how about the carpenter's oath in Frankfurt, which stated that members had to promise never to reveal the sacred angles of the guild nor to sketch its measurements by moonlight? That's not a joke. Apparently, measuring beams under moonlight was considered heretical or suspicious, either an act of sorcery or just a really inefficient way to check your rafters. And then there's the Painters' Guild in Bruges, which had a rule banning the use of unnatural colors in portraits. You couldn't paint someone's eyes purple even if they begged you. Artistic freedom? Not on their watch. Unless you painted religious themes. Then you could go nuts with golden halos and glowing saints. Just no blue hair, please. Guilds also held initiation rituals that bordered on the absurd. Before becoming a full-fledged journeyman, some apprentices were made to recite long, confusing rhymes backward while balancing tools on their heads. One German guild required initiates to kiss the belly of the wooden sow, a carved statue of a pig with a human face. Why? No one really knows. Some scholars think it was to weed out the overly serious. Others suspect the masters were just bored. And let's not forget the secret handshakes. Many guilds developed elaborate signs and gestures to identify fellow members. The Masons, in particular, were famous for this. Some rituals were said to involve whispered Latin phrases, foot taps under tables, or passing a coin from palm to palm in a specific pattern. Sound familiar? That's because some of these traditions eventually evolved into what we now call Freemasonry, a whole world of hidden handshakes and slightly too serious ceremonies. But the weirdest rule you've heard tonight? The Tailors of Ghent, who had a bylaw stating that if two masters showed up wearing the same hat to a guild feast, the one with the less decorative feather had to eat standing up. Petty? Yes, but also very on brand for medieval fashion politics. You lean closer to the door as the guildmaster begins reading from the old charter. His voice is loud, nasal, and a little bit pompous. He declares, "Let it be known that no smith shall quench his blade in the communal basin without first wiping it clean of sin." That's right. The blacksmiths believed that a blade forged in anger or cursed with bad intent could taint the shared water. One Flemish guild even made members sprinkle holy water into their quenching barrels on feast days, just in case. Of course, it wasn't all silly. Some rules genuinely protected workers. Guilds could prevent wage theft, ensure apprentices weren't overworked, and fund burials for members who died poor. They ran hospitals, sponsored festivals, and sometimes even wielded political power. But with power came paranoia. There were spy clauses, rules that forbade members from teaching their skills to outsiders. One German clockmakers' guild banned members from marrying foreigners, fearing that secrets of gear ratios and escapements would leak across borders. Imagine being told you couldn't date someone because their uncle was Swiss. And if you broke a rule, you could be fined, publicly shamed, or even expelled. There's a record from a Parisian brewers' guild where a member was made to carry a barrel of spoiled ale through the streets while shouting, "This is the drink of fools, and I brewed it poorly." That's one way to learn humility. You finally pull away from the door as the meeting ends, the sound of laughter and clinking mugs spilling into the cool night air. The rules may be weird, you think, but they're also a kind of glue, holding these trades together through centuries of war, famine, and change. Besides, one day, when you're a full guild member, you'll get to vote on the next strange rule. Maybe something about mandatory cloak tassels or a ban on singing during tanning. Medieval Europe didn't just make the laws weird, it made them personal, memorable, and occasionally just a bit ridiculous. As you walk home, you whisper the guild motto under your breath: work with honor, measure with care, and never wear green on Thursdays. Because, yes, that was a rule too. You're standing in the middle of a bustling town square. Market stalls packed shoulder to shoulder, vendors shouting about plums and piglets, someone somewhere definitely playing a hurdy-gurdy. But your eyes are fixed not on the bakers or butchers or fidgeting goats, but on the towering wooden structure at the far edge of the square, a scaffold. Not a gallows, not quite, but a raised platform made just tall enough to humiliate without offering the mercy of distance. This is the pillory, a medieval masterpiece of public humiliation. And oh, did the Middle Ages love public shaming. Forget silent punishments or private reprimands. Back then, if you messed up, the village needed to see it, and so did your neighbor's cousin's goat. You wander closer. The pillory is essentially a wooden frame with holes for your head and hands. Once locked in, you're stuck standing, bent slightly forward like someone perpetually caught in the middle of a regretful shrug. People point. Kids giggle. Someone tosses a turnip. You can't dodge. The punishment isn't just physical. It's social, psychological, and intensely itchy. But here's the thing. The crime didn't have to be serious. In fact, some of the weirdest medieval laws came with very creative forms of public embarrassment as punishment. Steal a loaf of bread? Pillory, lie under oath? Pillory, sell watered-down ale? You guessed it, pillory and an added fine of singing a bad song about your own dishonesty. One record from 14th century England describes a man sentenced to the pillory for impersonating a priest. But just standing there wasn't enough. He had to wear a fake mitre made from pigskin and recite a badly rhymed sermon every hour. Think of it as medieval stand-up comedy with a risk of tomatoes to the face. Historians still argue whether public punishments were truly effective deterrents or just crowd-pleasers. Some say people feared the social consequences more than the physical ones. Others believe communities secretly enjoyed watching their neighbors squirm. Maybe both. And the creativity didn't stop at the pillory. Ever hear of the cucking stool? If you're a woman accused of gossip, witchcraft, or simply being overly opinionated, whatever that means, the village might strap you into a wooden chair and dunk you repeatedly in the river. It was waterboarding meets slapstick comedy. You'd be wheeled through town first, just to let everyone know who was getting wet today, and then plunged under again and again to the cheers of onlookers. In some places, particularly in England, they developed custom cucking stools, some carved with the word "scold" in large letters, others painted garishly. One particularly vicious design in Derbyshire included a bell, rung every time the chair emerged from the water. Gossiping was apparently that serious. There's also the shaming flute, a lesser-known but unforgettable gem. Picture a thin wooden pipe, something like a recorder, but instead of being played, it's locked onto your neck and wrists, making it impossible to move without looking like a rejected orchestra mascot. Street performers who played poorly or without a license might be sentenced to wear the flute, paraded through town for all to laugh at their musical failures. Then there's the wooden donkey, a sharp-edged triangular beam on legs. Accused soldiers or repeat drunkards might be made to straddle it while weights were attached to their feet. It wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. And if the person cried out or fell off, they'd have to start again. It's like someone took a horse-shaped toy and made it 300% more awful. Of course, you didn't always need elaborate props. Sometimes a simple sign would do the trick. In some towns, if you were caught cheating customers at the market, you'd be forced to wear a sandwich board with your crime written on it. "I sold fake butter," or "I shorted the scales." Bonus shame if they made you shout it every few minutes. In 13th century France, there was even a law that required a false baker to be led through the streets with half-burned loaves tied to his back. It didn't hurt him, but it let everyone know, don't trust this guy with your bread. The punishment fit the crime, but often with a comedic twist. In Ghent, one man who repeatedly cursed during church services was made to sit on the church steps during every Sunday sermon for an entire year, wearing a giant wooden ear. A reminder, said the bishop, to better listen in the future. And if you think this only happened to peasants, think again. Nobles weren't always exempt from ridiculous punishments, especially when they crossed the wrong people. There's a juicy case from 14th century Bohemia where a local lord was accused of stealing a relic from a rival monastery. His sentence? To walk through the city barefoot, dressed in a monk's robe made of potato sacks, carrying a heavy wooden cross engraved with the words, "Lord of Thieves." It wasn't permanent, but his reputation never recovered. Punishment wasn't just about suffering. It was about performance. Sometimes that meant theatrical displays. In Milan, one court forced a man who insulted the town bell ringer to stand beside the bell tower and apologize aloud every time the bell chimed for a week. Imagine trying to nap while also confessing your guilt every quarter hour. Fringe fact? Some towns issued punishments known as mock processions. If you committed a minor infraction, say letting your pigs run wild, you might be forced to parade with the pigs, dressed in matching colors, and holding a sign that said, "Master of Swine and Chaos." Spectators loved it. You, maybe not so much. But perhaps the strangest punishment wasn't visual at all. It was sonic. In parts of rural France, if someone falsely accused another of a crime, they had to stand in the market square and sing their accusation aloud to the tune of a popular ballad. If they couldn't carry a tune, even better, the goal was shame, not art. Bonus points if passers-by clapped in rhythm. One man, having falsely accused a widow of stealing milk, was made to sing about the thieving cow that wore a bonnet. He was never taken seriously again. Eventually, public shaming as a legal punishment fell out of fashion. Enlightenment-era thinkers began arguing for prison systems and rehabilitation, but even then, traces of it lingered. Stocks weren't officially removed from English law until the 19th century, and even today, we still have traces of the same instinct. Scarlet letters replaced with headlines, pillories traded for hashtags. You step back from the scaffold now, imagining yourself trapped there for hours, itchy, stiff, embarrassed. A rotten tomato smacks the wooden frame beside you. Someone jeers. Another offers a sympathetic glance. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a stage. And in medieval Europe, justice came with an audience. The morning chill wraps around your ankles as you approach the edge of the village. Beyond the row of cottages and hedges lies an open meadow, now strangely quiet. At its center, a gallows. But this isn't for execution, at least not yet. Today, it serves a different purpose, one that's more bovine. A cow stands tethered nearby, looking thoroughly unimpressed. You rub your eyes. Is this a trial? Yes, because in medieval Europe, animals could be, and often were, put on trial. You read that right. In some parts of the Middle Ages, animals were dragged into courtrooms, given lawyers, charged with crimes, and even executed. Pigs, cows, horses, goats, dogs, and, brace yourself, even insects like locusts and weevils were treated as if they had legal responsibility. The same legal system that tried murderers also tried mice for stealing grain. You take a step back as a small crowd gathers. A friar steps forward, clears his throat, and begins to read aloud a formal indictment. The accused? A sow who allegedly killed a child. The tone is deadly serious. There's no sarcasm here, only solemnity. The sow is charged with infanticide. Witnesses are called. A local woman swears she saw the pig root through the yard and knock the cradle. Another says she warned the family about letting pigs too close. The trial continues. The pig snorts. A child cries. This isn't fiction. A real historical case from 1386 in Falaise, France, saw a pig tried for exactly that. The sow was found guilty, dressed in human clothing, and publicly hanged, complete with a full trial judge and executioner. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Across medieval France, Switzerland, and even parts of Italy and Germany, animal trials were a legal reality. Domestic animals like pigs were the most common defendants. Why pigs? Because they often roamed freely and were strong enough to cause real damage. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't merely a tragedy, it was a crime. But wait, it gets weirder. The animals weren't always treated as mere nuisances. No, they were given defense attorneys. Yes, actual lawyers tasked with defending a goose or a cow. One of the most famous was Bartholomew Chassenet, a 16th-century French jurist who rose to fame defending a group of rats accused of destroying a barley crop. His defense, genius. He argued that the rats weren't present in court because the roads were unsafe due to the presence of cats. The judge, remarkably, granted a continuance, delaying the trial to give the rats time to attend safely. The case was eventually dismissed. Chassenet's career soared after that. Historians still argue whether these trials were symbolic, religious, or bureaucratic theater. Some say they were moral lessons, teaching communities that justice applied to everyone, even animals. Others believed they were ways for towns to deal with grief and rage in the aftermath of tragedy. A pig kills a child. Someone needs to pay. The law provides a script. The villages get closure. There's also the strange intersection of theology and law. In medieval thought, animals were believed to be part of God's creation, but not without accountability. Genesis said man had dominion over animals, yes, but it didn't mean animals were above justice. If a pig acted like a killer, why not treat it like one? You glance back at the cow again. She's munching on hay, unaware of her legal peril. But not all trials were criminal. Ecclesiastical courts, the church courts, sometimes dealt with insect crimes. Imagine this. A swarm of locusts devastates a vineyard. The local clergy writes a legal complaint citing the locusts for willful destruction. They are ordered to appear in court. Of course, they don't. Rude. The church responds by excommunicating the insects. That's right. They excommunicated bugs. Sometimes entire colonies of weevils or caterpillars were formally cursed, banished from the region, or threatened with holy wrath unless they fled. In 1519, in Autun, France, a full trial was held against a group of vineyard snails. The judge appointed legal counsel for the snails and sent a summons. When the snails failed to appear, a second warning was issued. The church finally declared the vines cursed and urged the faithful to pray for protection. For there's one fringe account, historians debate its validity, of a town that tried a rooster for laying an egg. Why? Because a rooster that laid an egg was considered unnatural, possibly demonic, and therefore dangerous. The court found the rooster guilty of witchcraft and executed it. You raise an eyebrow. Witchcraft? For a chicken? Yup. In a time when the supernatural loomed large, anything that strayed from the natural order was fair game for suspicion. Animals weren't innocent bystanders. They were considered moral actors in a cosmic drama. But not all animals lost their cases. Some were acquitted. In 1750, a surprisingly late date, a donkey in France was accused of indecency. A priest, however, testified that the donkey was a most virtuous and well-behaved beast. The townspeople agreed, praising its gentle nature. The donkey was acquitted. Justice was served. What's perhaps most fascinating is the legal seriousness. Court records from these trials were meticulously kept. Transcripts were drafted, fines collected, sentences carried out. This wasn't backyard superstition. It was institutionalized absurdity. You start to wonder, were these people mad? But no, it's more complicated than that. In a world where divine order governed all things, where storms were punishments and miracles occurred on Wednesdays, it wasn't a big leap to imagine that animals too played by the rules of law. A misbehaving cow? That's not just an accident. It's rebellion. Of course, the Renaissance and Enlightenment eventually brought skepticism. Philosophers like Voltaire and Montaigne mocked the practice. Legal reformers scoffed. And by the 18th century, the animal trial era faded into history. But its records, painstakingly detailed, remain. A reminder of just how literal justice used to be. You glance again at the field. The cow is gone now, led back to the barn. No verdict was reached today. Maybe she'll get a retrial, or maybe the hay was her alibi all along. You stroll past the village square as twilight rolls in, bells tolling from the chapel tower behind you. Market stalls are folding up for the evening, the air filled with roasted onions, horse sweat, and the last whistles of tired tradesmen. But what stops you isn't the scent of food. It's the wall on the edge of town. Not just any wall. This one's covered in shoes. Old, worn-out, mismatched shoes. You raise an eyebrow. A monument to podiatry? A prank? Nope. A signpost of medieval punishment. Because in this part of Europe, being a bad tradesman could earn you more than angry customers. It could land you in public disgrace, or worse, strapped into a device known as the shame chair, forced to wear a shoe hat, or even banished from town. Welcome to the world of medieval public humiliation laws, where the punishment wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to make you wish it had. Punishments in the Middle Ages weren't all about tortured dungeons and spiked wheels. Sure, those existed, but across much of Europe, especially for smaller crimes, shame was the favorite tool of justice. Why? Because everyone knew everyone else. In a tiny village, your reputation was everything. Destroy that, and you might as well pack your turnips and go. Take the pillory, for example. You've seen it in movies, a wooden board with holes for your head and hands. But what you may not know is just how specific the rules around it were. Each town had its own shaming schedule. Mondays were for thieves, Tuesdays, blasphemers. Friday? Bakers who sold underweight bread. Yes, undersized loaves were a jailable offense. Bread was serious business. And there was more than one type of pillory. In parts of Germany, they used a neck violin, a wooden contraption that locked around your neck and wrists, forcing you into a permanent shrug of regret. Imagine explaining that to your mother-in-law at market. Sometimes, shame came with a musical number. In certain towns, offenders had to wear jingle bells on their shoes or tunics. The idea was that everyone would hear you coming, and no one would forget your offense. Noise as punishment, just like that time your neighbor played the recorder at 2 a.m. One curious favorite was the drunkard's cloak. Picture a barrel hollowed out with armholes cut into the sides. You're shoved inside it like a walking wine cask and paraded through town. Usually reserved for habitual drinkers or disorderly innkeepers, this punishment turned you into a waddling, sweating PSA. Don't be this guy. Historians still argue whether this was more effective than fines. Some say it worked wonders. Others point out that villagers often mocked offenders so much the public spectacle became more entertaining than corrective. Justice or street theater? Depends on the weather, probably. And then there's the scold's bridle. If you're thinking of a horse bit, you're not far off. This iron mask was strapped onto someone's head. Typically a woman accused of gossiping, nagging, or disturbing the peace with her tongue. The bridle often included a spike pressing down on the tongue to stop speech entirely. Disturbing? Definitely. Effective? Possibly. Terrifying? Undoubtedly. But even that paled next to the cuckold horns. In some French towns, a man whose wife was caught being unfaithful wasn't pitied. He was punished. He'd be made to wear large wooden horns mounted on a helmet and walk through the town square while townsfolk chanted rhymes about goats and dignity. The logic? If he didn't control his household, maybe he didn't deserve to walk around with his head held high. Some punishments were even more interactive. In England, the cucking stool, no, that's not a typo, was reserved for people convicted of public nuisances, usually women accused of slander, brawling, or being generally unwomanly. They were strapped into a chair and dunked repeatedly into a river or pond. Not enough to drown, just enough to soak your pride. Then there's the shame parades. One particularly odd case from Switzerland involved a man who sold spoiled fish. His sentence? To walk around town wearing a fish on a necklace with a sign that read, "Ask me about bad trout." He had to answer every question honestly, too. No PR spin allowed. But the weirdest might just be the false baker's parade. In parts of Hungary, bakers caught cheating on flour weights were made to ride backward on a donkey while holding a giant burnt loaf above their heads. The loaf would often be soaked in vinegar or dung to drive the point home. Behind them, drummers beat out a rhythm and children yelled, "Soft hands, soft bread," over and over. You're beginning to notice a theme. Medieval justice had a flair for the poetic. The punishment always mirrored the crime. Speak too loudly, lose your voice, sell sour wine, smell like it for a week, bake small loaves, ride a donkey with a shame baguette. And then there were the color codes. In Florence, prostitutes were made to wear yellow veils. In Paris, gamblers wore pink belts. In parts of Spain, debtors had to paint one boot red and the other white, an unmissable sign of fiscal failure. One German law even required thieves to wear striped cloaks, the original jailbird look hundreds of years before it became prison fashion. Open scholarly debate still exists around whether these shame-based punishments were more humane than corporal ones. Some historians argue they preserved life and limbs while still enforcing order. Others point out the long-term damage of public disgrace, how some people were driven out of towns entirely or into deeper crime. Modern parallels? Think about online shaming and cancel culture. The tools are different. The psychology's eerily familiar. And occasionally, the punishment backfired. There's one case, half fact, half legend, from Denmark, where a farmer accused of lying about his harvest was sentenced to carry a sign reading, "I am a liar." But instead of shame, the farmer wore it proudly, even decorated it with flowers. Villagers laughed, not at him, but with him. The law had tried to humiliate. He turned it into performance art. The charges were quietly dropped. Sometimes people fought back through fashion. In cities with color-coded shame laws, tailors would secretly stitch mocking symbols into the robes of judges and magistrates. Imagine trying to enforce moral purity while your own hemline reads, "Too much ale, not enough brain." You shake your head. Imagine living in a time when forgetting to weigh your bread properly could earn you a donkey ride of doom. And yet, there's a strange charm in how personalized medieval punishments were. They didn't just throw people into dungeons and forget them. They made a show of justice, one you were unlikely to forget and very likely to talk about over dinner. You reach the edge of the square and glance one more time at the wall of shoes, a quiet monument to small crimes and large egos, stitched together with straps, buckles, and just a little bit of public theater. And somewhere, in the whispers of the wind, you swear you hear it. Ask me about bad trout. The rain begins to tap gently on your hood as you shuffle down a narrow alley, cobblestones slick underfoot. You pass a bakery where the scent of burnt rye loaves still lingers. Someone probably misjudged their oven this morning. Hopefully no one had to ride a donkey for it. But ahead of you lies something altogether more bizarre. A modest home, shuttered and still, with a rough-hewn wooden sign nailed to the door. It reads, "Dwelling of the Dead." You're not at a morgue. You're standing in front of the home of someone legally, officially dead, even though they're very much alive. Because in medieval Europe, being declared dead wasn't always about your pulse. Sometimes it was about your paperwork, or lack of it. Welcome to the world of civil death. And yes, it was a real thing. Imagine waking up one morning to discover you're legally a ghost. Civil death was a legal concept across many parts of medieval Europe, from England and France to the Germanic states and beyond. It wasn't about actual mortality, it was about social extinction. The law could strip you of your rights, your possessions, even your name. You became a person who could no longer marry, sue, or inherit. You couldn't own property. You couldn't make a contract. In the eyes of the law, you were dust. And no, you didn't have to commit murder to earn this fate. You could be dead for far less. Refuse military service? Gone. Break an oath of fealty? Poof. Sometimes, even bankruptcy could result in civil death. It varied wildly from region to region, which meant the randomness added to the terror. Historians still argue whether these laws were more about punishment or social control. Probably both. One especially odd version of civil death was the status of the wolf's head in Anglo-Saxon and Norman law. Once outlawed, you were literally considered a wild animal. That meant anyone could kill you on sight. No trial, no questions. If you were lucky, people just avoided you. If not, well, hope you could run faster than a knight on horseback. You remember a local story, a blacksmith's apprentice who argued with his baron over unpaid wages. Next thing he knew, he was outlawed. He fled into the forest, never to be seen again. Some say he lives in the caves above the river, haunting the woods, forging horseshoes by moonlight. Others claim he died of exposure within the week. Either way, he stopped existing legally the moment his name was struck from the roll. But civil death wasn't just for men. Women, too, could be quietly erased. In some regions, when a woman entered a convent, she was declared dead to the world, a poetic phrase that had legal weight. She lost all rights to family inheritance. If she later tried to leave the religious life, too bad. She was already buried. There's one recorded case from 13th century France of a nun who escaped her convent, married a merchant, and tried to reclaim her share of family land. The court ruled that she was a spirit, not a sister. Her claim was denied, her marriage annulled, and her name struck from town records. Harsh? Sure. But to the court, the logic was airtight. She died the day she took her vows. One of the weirdest aspects of civil death? You could sometimes be revived. Legally, that is. It wasn't easy. It often took a royal pardon, public penance, or, in one Italian city, 3 days of barefoot fasting and a written apology in verse. Yes, a poem. Imagine trying to get your life back with a limerick. Here's a fringe tidbit. In some cases, people would fake their own deaths to escape civil death. One Flemish merchant, stripped of all rights for defaulting on a grain loan, vanished for 2 years and returned as his own cousin. New beard, new name, new life. And it worked, until his old dog recognized him and barked every time he passed. The neighbors got suspicious, arrested, deported, declared dead again. That dog? A furry little prosecutor. But not all cases were so theatrical. Sometimes civil death was handed down to entire families. A father's crime could stain his children, his wife, his siblings. They'd be considered tainted by blood and could be banned from markets, guilds, or town councils. You couldn't just ride out the storm. You inherited it. Imagine being born into a legal coffin you didn't even ask for. It wasn't just the law that played along. Villagers would stop speaking to you. Tradesmen wouldn't sell to you. Priests might refuse to give you last rites. If you were lucky, someone might leave you food at the edge of a field like they would for a stray cat. Otherwise, you learned to forage. There's an eerie story out of Bohemia about a man declared civilly dead for blasphemy. He built himself a small shack in the woods, lived alone for years, and carved messages into tree trunks. Things like, "I am not dead, I am only ignored." The trees were eventually cut down and used to build a tavern. Locals say if you drink there on certain nights, you can still see those carvings glowing in the grain of the wood. Creepy, a little, but somehow fitting. And yet, despite the cruelty, some people found ways to live within their erasure. A few built shadow communities, bands of outlaws, ex-nuns, disowned sons, living on the fringes of society. In France, one such group was nicknamed Les Gris, the Greys, because they wore soot-colored robes and lived in abandoned monasteries. They developed their own barter system, their own holidays. Outsiders thought they were cursed, but within their circle, they had names, stories, meaning. Some scholars believe these groups inspired parts of later European folklore, phantom cities, lost villages, ghostly travelers who ask for bread and vanish before dawn. The lines between the legally dead and the mythically undead got blurry fast. And if that doesn't give you goosebumps, nothing will. As the rain picks up, you take one last look at the shuttered house marked Dwelling of the Dead. The door creaks. Maybe the person inside is home. Maybe they're just trying to survive in a world that's forgotten them. Either way, you decide not to knock. Because in medieval Europe, being declared legally dead wasn't the end. It was just a different kind of afterlife. The sun dips behind the trees as you follow the crooked road toward a hilltop town, where the roofs lean like old men huddling against the wind and church bells toll the passing of another hour. You're getting used to the rhythm of medieval life now. Bread at dawn, bells at midday, paranoia at dusk. And in this town, paranoia takes a very specific shape. Sumptuary laws. Sounds fancy, right? It isn't. Sumptuary laws are basically fashion police with the full power of the crown. And tonight, you're walking straight into their finely stitched velvet-gloved grasp. At first, they seem harmless enough. After all, what's so bad about a law that tells you not to dress too extravagantly? But then you look closer. These weren't just guidelines. They were legal mandates about what you could wear, eat, and own, based entirely on your social rank. You could be fined, jailed, or publicly shamed simply for wearing the wrong kind of shoe. Say you're a blacksmith, good with iron, decent with math, respectable. But if you show up to church wearing a velvet doublet like a nobleman, that's a violation. You're dressing above your station. The punishment? Confiscation of the garment and maybe even a bit of time in the stocks, just long enough for your neighbors to snicker and throw cabbages at your dignity. Historians still argue whether these laws were about morality or control. On the surface, rulers claimed they were protecting society from vanity and excess. But deeper down, it's clear these laws were about maintaining the hierarchy, making sure everyone looked like they belonged exactly where they were born. Heaven forbid a merchant's daughter looks like a duchess. That might inspire ambition, and ambition That's dangerous. Let's get specific. In 14th century England, under Edward III, sumptuary laws laid out in painstaking detail who could wear what. If your income was less than $100 per year, which, trust me, was almost everyone, you couldn't wear fur. Period. Only the elite could wrap themselves in squirrel or miniver, and don't even look at ermine. Shoes had rules, too. The infamous poulain, a pointy-toed shoe that looked like it could double as a fencing weapon, was regulated by class. Nobles could wear shoes with tips 24 inches long. Knights got 12. Merchants, 6. Peasants, just enough to cover your toes. If your shoes curled past your social limit, you were fined per inch. Fringe fact: a particularly ambitious tailor once made poulains that curled all the way around and tied to his knees. Locals say he got arrested not because of the shoes, but because he tripped on them and knocked over the bishop's wine table. Hair and hats weren't exempt either. Women were banned from wearing silk veils or bejeweled headbands unless they were noble-born. And men? No gold chains, no embroidered sleeves, and definitely no cloth of gold tunics if you were from the middle class. One French edict actually banned the color purple for anyone not of royal blood. Why? Because purple was rare and expensive to make, dyed from thousands of crushed mollusks. And nothing says, "Stay in your lane," like forbidden snail fashion. Of course, the church loved sumptuary laws. Anything that discouraged luxury and encouraged humility got a big gold amen. Preachers often gave sermons against vanity, warning that too much lace and perfume would surely drag your soul to hell, and possibly give you gout. It wasn't just about sin. It was about keeping the social order divinely approved. There's a story from Siena in the 15th century. A merchant's wife wore a satin gown to a festival. It shimmered in the torchlight. A noblewoman saw her and demanded she be arrested on the spot. The magistrate agreed. The woman was fined, stripped of her gown, and forced to wear a coarse wool shift in public for a week. The noblewoman? She had her tailor copy the design, of course in richer fabric. The irony? Sumptuary laws were nearly impossible to enforce fairly. People got creative. One butcher's son lined his coat with fox fur but turned it inside out to avoid detection. Another wore illegal dyed silk under a long robe and just lifted it slightly when he walked. Sumptuary laws didn't stop ambition. They just turned it into a stealth mission. And yet, enforcement could be brutal when it served the powerful. In Venice, sumptuary officers were tasked with inspecting parties and ceremonies. They'd walk through banquets with little notebooks, writing down infractions like medieval fashion detectives. If someone wore forbidden pearls or too many rings, they might be fined, exiled, or have their property seized. Historians point to these laws as an early form of identity policing. You weren't allowed to look wealthy unless you were wealthy. The visual class system had to be sharp, consistent, unmistakable. And God help you if you blurred the lines. Still, the most ridiculous twist? Some nobles themselves resented the laws. They wanted to outshine each other. They didn't want to be limited to just one gem color or only 5 buttons per sleeve. So in time, they carved out loopholes. For themselves, of course. Certain cloaks were permitted if they displayed a family crest. Excessive jewelry was fine if it was inherited, and entire regions simply ignored the rules as long as no one complained too loudly. A favorite example: a countess in Burgundy who owned a silk dress woven with real gold thread and stitched with 37 miniature portraits of saints. Technically illegal. But when the bishop asked about it, she replied, "My dress is not pride, it is prayer." The court burst into laughter. She kept the dress. Sumptuary laws lingered for centuries. They evolved, shifted, faded, and flared up again. Elizabethan England doubled down on them. So did Renaissance Florence. But by the 18th century, as social mobility became harder to suppress and trade exploded across Europe, the laws became more symbolic than practical. Eventually, they vanished altogether, at least in writing. But you glance at your own clothes now, here in the darkening medieval street, and wonder, how much of this is really gone? After all, we still dress to signal status. We still judge people for wearing too much or not enough. Designer logos, dress codes, wedding guest etiquette. Maybe we've just gotten subtler. Or maybe we've swapped laws for likes. A night breeze picks up, tugging your cloak around your shoulders. It's simple wool, not dyed, not embroidered, just enough to keep you warm and legal. You keep walking, because tonight you don't feel like being arrested for fashion. You find yourself in the market square again, the place where chickens outnumber people and everyone knows exactly how many onions you bought last week. Stalls creak under the weight of salted fish, scratchy wool, and dented copperware. Town gossip flows faster than ale. But this time, you're not shopping. You're eavesdropping, because something strange is happening. A man just got fined for swearing, not for heresy, not for insulting a noble, just for muttering something spicy after stepping in dung. And it wasn't just a finger-wagging from the priest. It was a municipal offense, written into law. Welcome to the curious world of regulated speech in medieval Europe, where even your words could land you in trouble. You lean on a barrel and pretend to inspect a turnip as the reeve shuffles past, ledger in hand. He's not just counting taxes or grain. He's jotting down blasphemies, curses, and unlicensed jokes. Because, believe it or not, local laws often banned specific words, tones, or even jokes deemed inappropriate. And no, this isn't just about church stuff. It gets weirder. Let's start with the obvious. Blasphemy. Taking the Lord's name in vain? Big no. Swearing by God's bones or by Christ's blood? Not just rude, criminal. In some towns, every public swear could earn you a fine. Repeat offenders might be flogged or dunked in the river, and in deeply devout cities, you might be paraded through town with a placard reading blasphemer, basically medieval Yelp for sinners. There's a record from 15th century York where a man had to walk barefoot, shirtless, and with a rope around his neck because he mocked the Virgin Mary during a dice game. His friends laughed. He did not. But the laws didn't stop at religion. In certain places, idle speech was banned. That meant gossip, backtalk, or raucous laughter among women in the streets. Yes, laughter could be policed. And don't even think about singing bawdy songs in public, especially if they rhymed. Rhyming made it worse. Scholars still debate whether this was a moral issue or an early form of crowd control. But one thing's clear. If your joke was too good, it could get you jailed. Take the case of the Fool's Song. In a 14th century Flemish town, a local weaver composed a satirical ditty about the mayor's bald head and poor budgeting. The song spread like wildfire. Kids sang it in the street. Bakers hummed it while kneading dough. The mayor, he wasn't laughing. The weaver was arrested for mockery of magistrates and sentenced to 6 days in the pillory with his tongue clamped in iron. Ouch! And yes, there were actual tongue clamps. Historians still argue whether these punishments were symbolic or if they genuinely believed clamping a tongue could reform a personality. One court record lists a woman punished with a scold's bridle, an iron cage that fit over the head with a flat bit pressed against the tongue. Her crime: telling dirty jokes at a wake. The term scold, by the way, was an actual legal charge, typically applied to women who were too loud, opinionated, or sarcastic. So, if you're thinking of zinging the town baker for his burnt rolls, maybe hold off. There were even curfews on conversation. In some regions, towns enacted quiet hours after sunset. Speaking in public during these hours, especially in groups, could trigger suspicion of conspiracy, sorcery, or, worst of all, thinking too much. So, if you were caught whispering in the dark, better hope it was about livestock and not philosophy. Of course, enforcement varied wildly. In some places, reeves were overzealous, scribbling infractions like they were writing a play. In others, locals paid fines with a wink and carried on. But even in lenient towns, the rules made people paranoid. Imagine telling a joke, getting a laugh, and then remembering it might be illegal. One fringe case involves a traveling juggler who told a ribald story about a nun, a chicken, and a bucket of wine. Historians sadly redact the punchline. He was hauled before the local bishop and accused of speech unbecoming a Christian. He defended himself by saying the chicken was symbolic. The bishop did not appreciate the symbolism. The juggler was banished from town for a year and warned never to converse rhythmically again. Now, you might wonder, why so much fear over words? Because words had power. In a society where most people couldn't read or write, the spoken word carried immense weight. Stories, songs, and jokes shaped opinions, undermined authority, and passed on underground ideas. A clever rhyme could turn public sentiment faster than a sword. Even spells and curses were spoken aloud. Some towns banned not just swearing, but muttering, considered a sign of witchcraft or secret plotting. A farmer once got accused of cursing his neighbor's cow, simply because he whispered to himself while planting turnips. Spoiler: the cow got sick and the farmer got dunked in the river. Coincidence? In fact, silence was often safer than speech. And that's part of the chilling effect these laws had. People censored themselves. They spoke in vague metaphors. They stopped joking in public. Children were warned early, say the wrong thing, and you might not get dinner or freedom. Still, you hear murmurs. At the edge of the square, a pair of apprentices snicker quietly. You inch closer. One is mimicking the reeve's waddling walk. The other mimics the priest's voice, raising imaginary fists against moral decay. It's hilarious, and it's risky. They glance around nervously. Even now, speech remains rebellion. You lean back against the barrel and pretend you're just another turnip looker. But inside, you marvel at the idea. In medieval Europe, a well-timed joke could be an act of revolution. A clever pun, practically treason. So, maybe keep your humor subtle tonight. And if you absolutely must tell a joke, make sure the reeve's out of earshot. The cobbled path leads you toward a strange building, part chapel, part barn, part government office. You glance up at the archway. There's no sign, just a carved wooden emblem, a goat on one side, a bishop on the other, and in between, a pair of underpants. You blink. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, a bizarre, obsessive medieval attempt to regulate exactly what people could wear, eat, and spend based entirely on who they were. Inside, a tailor is being interrogated for selling silk sleeves to a fishmonger's wife. A woman weeps in the corner. Her crime? Wearing a veil with gold trim, even though her husband is just a mason. And in the back room, a shoemaker is being fined for adding too many buckles. Yes, buckles. Because in the Middle Ages, fashion was not just a personal choice. It was a legal matter. And if you dressed above your station, you weren't just being flashy, you were breaking the law. Sumptuary laws were like an early form of social zoning, designed to preserve the visible hierarchy of society. These laws told you what fabric you could wear, how many buttons your coat could have, what color your cloak could be, how long your shoes could get, even what kind of meat you could eat on a Tuesday. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely enforceable, or more of a performative flex by the ruling classes. Either way, they dominated medieval life. You pass a cart where guards are unloading confiscated items, velvet hoods, crimson laces, embroidered gloves, all forbidden for anyone below knight status. That's right, the color crimson was often outlawed for peasants, too royal. So were pointy shoes, a fad that swept Europe in the 14th century. These were shoes so long and curled at the toe that some required wire supports or little chains to your knees to hold them up. The longer your shoes, the higher your status. Laws began limiting length. A knight could wear shoes 18 inches long. A merchant, maybe 12. A farmer, 6 max. Imagine being fined because your shoes were too snazzy. Even hats weren't safe. Certain towns banned beaver felt hats for anyone under the rank of guildmaster. And woe to the serf caught wearing ermine, a fur reserved for royalty and very high clergy. The irony? Most people never even saw ermine in their lifetime, but they knew not to touch it. The rules varied wildly by region. In Florence, laws stated that unmarried women could wear pearls, but only if they were daughters of merchants or nobility. In England, under Edward III, tailors were required to sew specific symbols into clothing based on social class. If you tried to hide your humble origins under borrowed silks, you could be fined, stripped in public, or sent to the stocks. One quirky footnote: there was a real case in 1463 England where a butcher's daughter got married wearing a gown made of imported velvet. The town elders decided she had implied gentility by doing so. Her punishment? The velvet was publicly burned, and her marriage was considered legally ostentatious, whatever that means. Of course, sumptuary laws didn't stop at clothing. They also governed feasts. Only certain classes could serve 3 courses or more. Some places limited the number of meat dishes per meal based on rank. Others capped the number of guests allowed at weddings. So, if you were a minor merchant throwing a feast with roast swan and 6 kinds of pie, that could get you excommunicated and fined. You hear the phrase cake crime and do a double take. Turns out, in some parts of France and Italy, elaborate cakes and pastries were considered signs of excess. There's even a record from 1399 Venice, where a baker was fined for selling jeweled sugar confections to a grocer's wife. Sugar sculptures were considered noble indulgences, definitely not for the garlic-fingered classes. This leads to some comically fringe cases. In 1471, a young scribe in Milan was arrested for gilding the edge of his porridge with edible gold leaf, meant as a joke. His defense? I was hungry and wanted to feel like a duke. The judge did not laugh. The gold was confiscated, and the scribe sentenced to a week of eating only stale bread and radishes. Harsh. And of course, there were loopholes. Some clever folks got around the rules by dressing extravagantly in private, or by borrowing noble clothes for portrait sittings. There's even a painting of a miller from Bruges, posing in lace gloves and a doublet with gold trim. Scholars argue to this day whether it was rebellion or rented for the hour. Either way, it lives forever. You pass by another sign pinned to a public post, "Let no merchant wear velvet of Venice, nor gold-threaded hose, lest he shame his station and bring envy upon the town." Strong words for pants. Sumptuary laws were also deeply gendered. Women's clothing was especially scrutinized. Necklines, sleeve length, ornamentation. A married woman showing too much wrist? Scandalous. A widow wearing bright green? Unacceptable. One widow in Bavaria was actually charged with colorful arrogance. There's even a case of pregnant women being fined for wearing satin, under the theory that maternity did not elevate status. And the enforcement? Sometimes absurd. Local officials, known as wardrobe watchmen or dress reeves, were tasked with walking the streets and evaluating people's attire. Imagine being chased down because your lace trim looked a little too French. These enforcers often carried portable charts comparing fabrics to ranks, like the medieval version of a fashion police flipbook. But the truth is, these laws weren't just about fashion, they were about control. The nobility feared social mobility, and fashion was one of the easiest ways the rising merchant class could imitate the elite. If you could dress like a lord, maybe you'd start thinking like one. That, to medieval authorities, was terrifying. Still, the laws often failed in practice. People found ways around them. Markets thrived on black market velvet. Traveling entertainers and actors often wore outrageous costumes as exempt performers. And in cities with more open economies like Venice or Bruges, the laws were more gesture than gospel. By the Renaissance, these laws began to fade, mocked by humanists and ignored by growing middle classes. But for centuries, they shaped not just wardrobes, but identities. You pause by a fabric stall and run your fingers along a bolt of blue cloth. Not royal blue, just ordinary dye. Still, you imagine what it would be like to wear the forbidden crimson, not to rebel, just to be seen. There's a hush in the town square tonight, a soft lull in the usual clamor of carts and chatter. You pause beneath the creaking sign of a tavern, and for a moment you wonder if you're hearing it right. Faint, but clear. Bells. Not church bells, smaller, softer, somewhere high above the rooftops. You squint upward, and then you see it. Perched on the edge of the gabled roof, clutching a dusty scroll and wearing a battered tin crown, is a jester. But not just any jester. This one is sentencing someone. With great solemnity, he unfurls the parchment and begins to read, "By order of the Fools' Tribunal, let it be known that Tom the miller's goat is guilty of impersonating a knight." People around you chuckle, and a few clap. One woman bows deeply, playing along, because tonight it's Fool's Law Day, a real medieval tradition in some parts of Europe where, for just one day, the law belonged to jesters, mischief makers, and children. Yes, Actual medieval towns temporarily gave power to fools. These Feast of Fools celebrations, also called misrule or fools' courts, allowed society to flip itself upside down. The lowest could become the highest. The clergy were mocked. Local nobles were parodied. A pig might be crowned pope. And instead of the usual grimness of medieval justice, people embraced satire, parody, and absurdity. It wasn't just for laughs, though there were plenty. These days were pressure valves for deeply unequal societies. A moment where you could poke fun at your lord, roast the village reeve, or sentence your neighbor to dance in the square for wearing ugly shoes. For once, the law wasn't something to fear. It was a shared joke. Historians still argue whether these festivities were sanctioned anarchy or tightly controlled play. But there are records of towns appointing a lord of misrule, chosen by lottery or mock election, who would preside over the town's mock court with all the pomp of real authority. Some towns had a boy bishop, elected from choir boys to oversee services during certain holy days, a literal child taking on the role of the bishop. Of course, things got weird fast. In some regions of France and the Low Countries, fools could issue mock decrees, fine people for serious crimes like eating all the pies or combing your hair like a Saxon. One town in Normandy had a record of a mock trial where a local donkey was found guilty of braying during Vespers. The sentence? A flower crown and a parade through town to much applause. And while all this seems like harmless fun, these traditions walked a thin line. Sometimes they got out of hand. In a few extreme cases, the fools ended up pillaging wine cellars or stripping officials of their real clothes, accidentally turning parody into riot. That's when the church and ruling classes began to push back. By the late Middle Ages, many towns had banned misrule altogether, calling it irreverent, disorderly, even heretical. The idea of children pretending to be bishops didn't sit well with actual bishops, and the satire too sharp. Still, people clung to the rituals, because no matter how strange they got, these inverted courts held deep appeal. They were a taste of justice, reimagined, not harsh, not terrifying, but laced with laughter and humanity. You move deeper into the square, where the fool's court is now trying a chicken. The charge? Laying eggs on the magistrate's doorstep without a permit. The sentence? A new coop. Someone in the crowd suggests execution and is promptly pelted with breadcrumbs. It's all ridiculous and somehow comforting. It reminds you that not all medieval laws were about pain, punishment, or paranoia. Some were about play, about reminding people, even for a moment, that the world didn't always have to be grim and hierarchical. That laughter itself could be a kind of resistance. And now, after wandering through the strangest corners of medieval law, from cheese taxes to pig trials, pointy shoes to pudding fraud, you finally begin to feel the journey winding down. Wind down. Final 300 words. The firelight flickers in the town square now, its soft glow casting long shadows across the stones. Somewhere, a lute plays a slow, droning tune, and you feel your muscles ease into the rhythm. The laughter fades to murmurs. Even the fools quiet down, their tin crowns tilting as they yawn. You find a spot against an old barrel, the wood warm from the day's sun. The air carries the faint scent of baked apples, candle wax, and straw. You close your eyes. You've walked through a world both absurd and all too human. A world where laws tried to contain vanity, punish bad bread, ban bright socks, and regulate who could wear purple. Where pigs were put on trial and you could be fined for smiling too smugly while eating eel. And yet, underneath it all, there was always structure, always order, even if it made no sense to us today. So many of these rules were ways to make sense of a chaotic world, and some were just people being weird, gloriously, inventively weird. Let that strangeness soothe you now. Let it remind you that the world has always been full of quirks and contradictions, and that even the most baffling laws at their core were just people trying, often failing, to make life more bearable. So rest easy now. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift. You're safe. No one's going to tax your candlelight or fine you for dreaming above your station. Not tonight. The bells are silent. The square is still, and somewhere, deep in the archives of time, a jester smiles. End of script. Sweet dreams.